Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Asia Society. Our program will begin in 5 minutes. We are still expecting people to file in into the auditorium. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And to those watching in Asia and around the world, good morning and good evening, and a very, very warm welcome as we inaugurate the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis. We are absolutely delighted that you could come and take part in celebrating this exciting new chapter in the history of the Asia Society. I'm Bates Gill. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for China Analysis, and it's a great honor for me and a great pleasure to be able to take up this role. I want to thank in particular Dr. Kevin Rudd, as well as the Asia Society Board of Trustees, our donors, and all of the colleagues here for this remarkable opportunity. Congratulations are certainly in order to you, Kevin, for having the vision and the gumption to bring the center to where it is today. I look forward to working with you and with all of the supporters, friends, and partners of the Asia Society to build a leading global center for policy-relevant, objective analysis of China and its impact in its region and the world. You know, it's hard to believe, but true, that about 20 years ago, one of the world's most prominent China analysts wrote an article in the pages of Foreign Affairs. The article was entitled, "Does China Matter?" The article deeply questioned the country's significance as a market, as a power, and as a source of ideas. Now, I didn't agree with that argument then, and I think we can all agree it surely does not apply today. Indeed, China, in my mind, has the potential to impact world affairs more in the next 10 years than it has in the past 30, for better and for worse. All the more reason, then, I think, to establish this center, drawing from our world-class China expertise as well as from the Asia Society's global network of affiliates. We are in an excellent position to understand China from the inside out and to counsel governments, the private sector, and the broader public, all increasingly in need of well-informed, reliable insights and actionable advice about China's trajectory and its implications in what is becoming an ever more uncertain and contested world. And that's just what we are going to be doing today. Speaking of world-class China expertise, we have assembled a remarkable lineup of folks for today, and I would like to just quickly walk you through the proceedings. To kick off things, we'll soon hear from Dr. Henry Kissinger, as well as Dr. Kevin Rudd, who will be formally introduced in just a moment. Following their discussions, we'll take a short break and then regroup for a series of 3 short panels featuring a dozen of the new center's experts, ranging across the 5 principal pillars of our work: China's domestic politics, economy and technology, foreign policy and national security, society, culture and health, and environment and energy. Then following the panels, Kevin will offer some concluding remarks, and then you're all invited to join a celebratory reception from about 6 p.m. tonight. In closing, do please allow me to extend my thanks to everyone here at the Asia Society who's worked very, very hard to organize today's events. And in particular, I'd like to thank Inger Marie Rossing, Morgan Spies, and Carolina Fowler. Now, it is my great pleasure to pass the microphone over to my colleague, Mr. Jing Qian, the Managing Director of the Center for China Analysis, who will introduce Dr. Rudd. Jing has been at the heart of the center from its very beginning, literally present at the creation and playing a central role really over the past 5 years, from its conception to its design and now its realization. And I greatly appreciate Jing's insights and support and look forward to continuing our very close working relationship as we further expand the size, the reach, and the impact of the new center. So Jing, over to you.
Dr. Kissinger, Dr. Rudd, thank you, Bates, very much. It is a blessing, truly, to have you joining us with your first-class institutional leadership, and my true pleasure to co-lead our center forward together. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to our inauguration. My name is Qian Jing. I'm the Managing Director of the Center for China Analysis, and also a Senior China Advisor to China. to Kevin for the better part of the past decade. So I have had the privilege to work closely with Kevin, traveled together for millions of miles, meeting countless people in Beijing, DC, and elsewhere, to make our modest middleway contribution to the betterment of the U.S. China relations. So it's truly my delight and honor to introduce Kevin today. Over the past decades, among all the changing duties Kevin has been fulfilling, at the national, regional, and international stage as a Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, climate action pioneer, distinguished fellow, author, speaker, and now the global president and CEO of Asia Society, there's one thing that will remain constant, unchanging, is his passion for China. As we all know, Kevin is first and foremost a China scholar, a sinologist, who started his journey of studying the Middle Kingdom from age of 15, when his mother handed him wisely the headline of China joining the UN in 1972. And since 1976, he has been studying Chinese language and history at the Australia National University, where he got his well-known Chinese name Lu Kewen, which meaning the conqueror of the classics. How successful that is, we leave to the history to judge. Then 5 years later, he graduated with his honor thesis, exploring the concept of human rights in the Chinese classic tradition. Fast forwarding 40 years, after meeting generations of Chinese leaders, including Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping, while fulfilling all other duties as mentioned above, Kevin has amazingly completed his DPhil at Oxford just 3 weeks ago, and it's not an ordinary one, but real hard work for 4 years, reading and defining Xi Jinping's ideology and worldview, while analyzing its impact on China and beyond. This was surely not for the faint-hearted. It is to help all of us to know China better, to understand China's role in the world better, and to navigate our shared futures better. In that same spirit, Kevin, with generous support from our trustees and donors, decided to establish the Center for China Analysis 2 years ago as part of Asia Society Policy Institute, trying to build an ecosystem with intergenerational China scholars while providing evidence-based, policy-relevant China analysis. So here we are today, witnessing the birth of the new center together. So ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hand together for the founding chair of the Center for China Analysis, the Honorable Dr. Kevin Michael Rudd.
Thank you, Jing, for those overgenerous remarks. Henry, you are such a welcome guest here at the Asia Society. It's wonderful to have you back. Former Secretary of State, former National Security Advisor of the United States, and a source of continuing wisdom for us all. Our distinguished trustees who are with us, Joe Tsai, Lulu Wang, Hamid Biglari, Nick Raharton, Mark Tucker, Frank Brown, and Josephine Linden, and our distinguished guests, including Ray Dalio, Andreas Dracopoulos, David Miliband, President of the IRC, as well as Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and others who are with us today. Thank you so much for sharing this important occasion with us all. Our other distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen as well, welcome. The continent we call Asia has undergone tumultuous change since this institution first began. The difficult processes of decolonization, in some countries the rise of revolutionary movements which have since become enduring, long-established governments of their countries, the long and difficult processes of economic development, in many countries poverty having been transformed into prosperity, although in others poverty still remains. Large-scale social change brought about through the relentless processes of urbanization, and more recently the ravages of climate change. In the midst of all of this, and all these great changes across our region, geopolitics has always loomed large. And it was against this background that John D. Rockefeller III, back in 1956, at the height of the Cold War, had the remarkable vision of establishing the Asia Society. His mission was straightforward: to build bridges between the emerging countries, cultures and economies of Asia with the United States. And in intervening 2/3 of a century, this institution has proudly played host to political leaders from virtually every country across Asia. Sometimes their visits have been the subject of great controversy, other times more routine. But our mission has remained the same: to add light rather than heat to the discourse in order to find pathways through the seemingly intractable challenges of our age. We've done this through arts and culture, we've done this through education, we've done this through using our extraordinary convening power to bring together leaders from across politics, business, and the other realms of public life in order to find common understanding where it could be found. The Asia Society, therefore, is a good institution. It's part of the firmament of our national and international discourse here in the United States and across our global network of 15 centres, and we're proud of the institution. Consistent with this tradition of forging common understanding across disparate cultures, the trustees of the Asia Society back in 2014 decided to establish the Asia Society Policy Institute. Indeed, Dr. K, back in 2014, you launched the Institute from this very same stage. Thank you for giving me a job. Because I was honoured by the trustees to become the Institute's inaugural president in 2015, not long after I came second in the Australian elections the previous year. We began as an Asia Society Policy Institute with just 5 staff, and 7 years later I'm pleased to report that we are now supported by nearly 50 full and part-time staff, making us one of the larger concentrated policy research institutes focused on Asia here in the United States. Our mission statement, consistent with the Asia Society itself, is one of navigating shared futures. We see ourselves also as a think tank and a do tank. We're not into the business of just thinking alone. Thinking is the sound of one hand clapping. Thinking and doing is the sound of 2 hands clapping. And whether it is on U.S. China relations, on trade negotiations, or on climate change, we have always seen our work as being one which translates theory into practice, rather than producing a report in the vain hope that somewhere, there will be someone in the world who will read it at some stage. No, we see our role as working with the decision makers, both in Washington and other capitals across the Asia-Pacific region, in order to move the dial forwards, to interpolate our policy recommendations into the world of policy reality wherever possible. We claim no unique wisdom in doing this. We have always placed priority, however, consistent with our traditions, on how the other side thinks and why they think that way, rather than just acting as an unthinking cheer squad for whatever the current iteration of US foreign, trade or strategic policy might happen to be. And this brings us to what I hope will become the 3rd great innovation in the historical evolution of the Asia Society, which is the formal establishment within the Asia Society Policy Institute of a dedicated Centre for China Analysis. You might ask, why do we need another China Centre here in the United States? Well, the answer, I believe, lies in a number of factors. One is that it's important to bring together the full spectrum of China's specializations under one roof in order to bring together the best integrated analysis of contemporary China that is possible. My experience of the China analytical world, both here in the United States and across the rest of the world, is that there is no lack of analysis on different aspects of China's rise. What I find there is a lack of is synthesis in drawing the threads of disparate analysis together into an integrated whole that can make sense to policymakers. That is why the Centre for China Analysis will bring together expertise on Chinese domestic politics, China's domestic economy, new developments in Chinese society and culture, rapid advances in Chinese technology, as well as the most recent developments in Chinese foreign and security policy, and of course, China's impact on climate. In the minds of the Chinese leadership, all these things relate to each other. Therefore, I think it's useful for other international leaders to have available to them integrated analyses of Chinese politics and policy in a way that also relates the part to the whole. If there's a second distinguishing feature of the Centre for China Analysis, it'll be the priority we attach to Chinese language sources. Many of the debates on China's foreign and domestic policy are well ventilated by China's own domestic discourse, often freely available in its own public literature, assuming, of course, you know where to find it, and assuming, of course, you'll put in the effort to read the Chinese original sources. We therefore intend to make maximum use of Chinese domestic journals, publications, newspapers, and online information as the Chinese system itself seeks to communicate across the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people new directions in politics, the economy, and foreign policy. That's not to say we'll believe everything that we read, but it's important to understand how the Chinese system speaks to itself. It's what we describe in the CCA as our inside-outside angle of looking at China. And a third feature of the Centre for China Analysis is that we will be providing independent, robust, and vigorously objective analysis of where China is going and what it means for the United States and the rest of the region and the world. This means that we will be critical of Chinese policy whenever necessary, but also means we will bring a critical approach to bear on US policy, where we also judge that to be necessary. Finally, the Centre for China Analysis will work closely with the rest of the Asia Society Policy Institute, of which it is part, given that China's engagement with the rest of Northeast, Southeast and South Asia is of critical relevance both to the region and the world. I'm delighted that we've secured the services of a respected sinologist, Dr. Bates Gill, as the inaugural Executive Director of CCA. Bates brings expertise to this task, great expertise to this task, and I wish him well, and to the rest of his team. And Bates will be supported in this by my friend and colleague Chen Jing, who will be Managing Director of the CCA. CCA will also work closely with the Ross Centre on U.S. China Relations under Vice President Orville Schell, given the formidable expertise available to that centre and the contribution it has already made to China scholarship through the outstanding publication that it has run for some time now called Chinafile. Today, therefore, is a great day for the Asia Society. We have a rich history. We also have a robust future. And when I speak of rich histories, Henry, and I speak of robust futures, I can think of no one more robust than Henry Kissinger to be with us today, to be an integral part of this important occasion, launching our new centre. Ladies and gentlemen, it is therefore with great pleasure that I officially launch the Centre for China Analysis of the Asia Society Policy Institute. So, Henry, thank you for being with us. It's good that you could come along. To start off on something really easy, let's talk about Xi Jinping's ideology. Now, you've met a few Chinese leaders over the years. You've met Mao Zedong, you've met Jiang Zemin, you've met Hu Jintao, and a whole bunch of others. And Xi Jinping is a leader that begins to talk more and more again about Marxism-Leninism. So, in your observation, what differences do you see between the Mao Zedong that you have met and the Xi Jinping that you've also met on many occasions? Over to you, Henry.
Well, first, let me thank you for your kind words and also for inviting me. The project you're starting today is of great academic importance, but it's also of great foreign policy importance, because I think this is perhaps the most fraught international situation in terms of its evolution that I know. And the key issues are between two countries of substantially different cultural outlook and history on the nature of the world. And so an institution like this, of the scope that has been described, and led by a man whom I've known for decades and respected, and who has contributed so much to my own thinking, is a guarantee of an important contribution to the biggest international challenge of our period. Now, how do I perceive Xi? It's the characteristic of the Western approach to foreign policy, and especially the American approach, is to identify the policy of a country with the personality of its leader. And there is considerable merit in that. But when it's then taken to the point where the personal relationship between American or Western leaders and Chinese leaders are considered a key factor, then it fails to understand the essence of Chinese thinking about foreign policy as I perceive it, which is that history does not consist of the solution of specific problems, but that specific problems are part of a process which one has to master in order to conduct foreign policy. The elimination or the reduction of a problem is, in that view, an admission ticket to a new set of problems, to an endless set of problems. And that is what the statesman has to understand, rather than the immediate issues. So, of course, Mao and you also have to consider that I'm not a student of China from an academic point of view. I was involved in it because when we opened to China, Nixon thought I was the best informed person about his thinking for going to China, and also probably more controllable since I was on his staff than anybody else he could think of. So when I met Mao, the Cultural Revolution was still going on. Tens of millions had been killed under his aegis. But when I met him, he was eager to enlist America in an anti-Soviet policy, or at least to create the impression that America, in certain circumstances, might consider China an essential element of international affairs. So, in a very early conversation with him, he urged me to make sure that Japan continued to believe in its American alliance, and not think that China was trying to replace it as America's favorite Asian country. But this was in clearly tactical position from which one couldn't draw any conclusions about the peaceful intentions. Mao was in conversations. He rarely stated his view in any continuous way. He invariably began the conversation with a question and then turned it into a dialogue that, as the confidence returned, became more and more aimed at his own strategic objectives, which were to isolate the Soviet Union. In our time, he did not cherish economic negotiations and was extremely reluctant to undertake them. In fact, in the 5th year of our opening to China, the economic relations with China were at the level of our relations with Honduras. The economic development of China occurred entirely under Deng Xiaoping. Having mentioned these mellow aspects of Mao, if one looks at his history and his subsequent policy or tone towards us, it became increasingly assertive as the danger of war diminished. But he kept his conversations with American presidents. I was present at the conversation with Nixon and the conversation with Ford. And I've described the beginning, but by the end, by my last conversation, he said something like this. He said, "You Americans remind me of swallows who fly up into the air when a storm approaches and flap your wings. But you and I, Professor," he said, "we know that the flapping of the wings does not affect the coming of the storm." And so there was, at that point, a kind of sinister aspect to that conversation. So Mao appeared as an ideologist who was practicing strategic policy for Chinese tactical reasons, and led to no ultimate conclusions, or he professed no ultimate conclusions where it would lead as it evolved. But from what I know about his life, his treatment of the Soviet Union, he would have tried to assert Chinese eminence in a manner that it never looked as if China would have to accept policy directions or even policy advice. So he was a figure of great strategic competence, but philosophically, from the combination of what one knows about him now and even of his conversations with me, I would say he would raise great strategic questions about his ultimate aims. I met Xi in an earlier stage of his career, before he was president. But I think he was already vice president. I'm pretty sure he was already vice president. And he, of course, had no record. And he couldn't evoke the same mystical atmosphere around his advisors than what I'm talking about. But in his early conversations with me, the Cultural Revolution was still a living experience. And I asked him about what its impact would be on future Chinese generations. And he described it as a searing experience in which, and his father, who was purged, and he and his father had to live in a cave for a period of time, which he described not with self-pity, but with the conclusion, this is not something we should now regret. This is something that strengthened us, and it made us capable of facing almost any challenge. And therefore the Cultural Revolution, on the whole, was a good thing for China, even though he personally and his family suffered extremely. Again, the Xi that I have experienced has, of course, two parts. One, he is very conscious, in my observation, of the requirements of power, and that it's obvious. But it's also, at least again in my conversations, been quite reflective about the kind of international system that he would want or prefer. And he would speak of win-win situations. And on the other hand, he leaves no doubt that he will not rely entirely or primarily on the goodwill of the system. And he wants to create an international situation in which win-win is based on a classical balance of power. And he probably thinks a lot about that, because I've also known some of his close personal associates. So he is a formidable adversary, and one should not gear one's policy or one's addresses to him on the basis of some conversion that would make him change his judgment either about internal order or international order. And he seems to be also extremely conscious that the great tragedies in Chinese history have occurred as a result of internal collapse, and that he would want to forestall that. The question that is now open, whether it is possible to create a diplomacy with them that permits a resolution of the threatening impacts on humanity by diplomatic means, or whether the relationship has to be based entirely on an assessment of two sides that are constantly building their strengths. There's no substitute for building strengths, and one cannot use the argument for dialogue with him on the idea that one therefore needs less military capacity. But the question exists whether it is possible to create a kind of conversation with him that moves away from the Maoist perception of the world to a Chinese Marxist one. My instinct is that he uses Marxism as the best tool for centralized power, and not as Mao would, as a kind of distinct religion. As you know, Kevin, I have advocated the need for dialogue, and I believe it is possible. It will be a sober process without exaltation, but it should be possible on the basis of a recognition of the forces that drive the world right now towards a very dangerous conflict, and make the conflict so devastating. So that has been my basic view during the Xi presidency, and it's the key issue before our society, and not a partisan issue.
So your argument overall in the current relationship is what I would describe as strategic engagement through continued enhancement of, or based on the continued enhancement of American strength as well. That you cannot detach engagement from strength, that in fact strength provides the basis for effective engagement.
But nor can you detach strengths from outcomes and simply judge it by a theoretical assessment of a constantly evolving, changing technology. So it is a task no society has faced in that form previously.
You mentioned before in your discussions with Mao, some years ago now, the question of the Soviet Union. And Mao's then interest, deep interest in engaging you in what was then his unfolding dilemma with the Soviet Union following the Sino-Soviet split, and the emergence of conflict on the Sino-Soviet border. You also referred to Mao's analogy about storms and swallows flitting into the air and flapping their wings furiously. So let's flip forward 50 years and talk about the successor of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Putin. Things are not going terribly well in the Ukraine. I think that's the understatement of the week. This was a military venture launched in February, which has turned into military and political and foreign policy folly. Given your deep engagement with successive Chinese leaders, how do you think Beijing now looks at Russia and Putin, and where this could lead, given the emerging speculation about the durability of Putin's leadership? And where does that end up in geopolitics?
Well, they have a number of conflicting emotions. When one looks at the conversations of Xi with Putin following the Olympics, but prior to the invasion of Ukraine by the Soviet Union, Xi gave a rather blank check to Putin by saying the alignment is indissoluble. And he must have expected that Putin would succeed.
Without limit, I think he said. A relationship without limit.
And simultaneously, he came out against NATO expansion. So if Putin had succeeded in occupying Ukraine, in the subsequent confrontation, China would have put itself on the side of Russia in the confrontation with whatever part of Europe would resist him, or all of Europe if it resisted him. And so that must have reflected his judgment of the balance of power at the moment, because he had no need to get himself into that issue. So he will have to adjust his thinking and Chinese policy to the reality of a much weaker Russia than he had estimated, or that anyone had imagined at the period. And it will raise totally new problems, namely, first, a technical problem. What if you've proclaimed your alliance? At what point are you obliged to give some help without destroying the validity of your assertions of support? But he seems to have decided to accept the damage here. But if Russia approaches collapse, which is now possible, will he interpret this as a forerunner of ambitions we might develop towards China, and therefore the need for policies that forestall any such expectations on our side, and therefore some growing activity in a yet not existing peace process? Or will he conclude it as some evolutions that he will have to accept, build his strengths but attempt to avoid getting into the same position that Putin got himself into, and therefore begin a more conciliatory dialogue with the United States. I actually think that is the conclusion he will reach, and that this is what may emerge from the party congress. But if he comes to that analysis at a moment that the Chinese internal situation weakens greatly, he may then have to conclude, or may then conclude, that nationalism is its best way to avoid the tendencies that might emerge. I tend to believe that he will attempt the former and reserve the issue of confrontation for a later point in his administration. And we should always have in mind that we shouldn't foreclose a more deliberate effort by the two countries to bring about a more peaceful structure, because I really don't believe they have an alternative of war with a kind of technology of automatic weapons for which nobody has any experience in their use, where decisions will lead to escalation by the briefness of time that is available to them and the limited experience one has with the actual use.
Yes, autonomous weapon systems changes the entire nature of politics and warfare. You think when Xi Jinping looks back on his fateful conversation with Vladimir Putin on the 4th of February, he will have some levels of regret, it seems.
He must.
Because, as you know, in Sun Art of War, the first chapter reads, "War is a great matter of state. If you lose the war, you lose the state." And Vladimir the Impaler seems to have forgotten this fundamental principle because he has rolled the dice with Ukraine and it has turned out profoundly badly for him. But on your strategic implications, you chart two possibilities. One, if Russia continues to lose in Ukraine, which seems at this stage militarily probable, and second, that there are further implosions within domestic Russian politics, perhaps even culminating in the very Russian state itself, then under those circumstances, Xi must suffer some level of damage domestically, politically in China for having thrown in his lot in an unqualified fashion. But beyond that, what your argument is that it then goes either of two ways. Xi Jinping with the United States then is looking at possibilities of calming it down with America, restabilising the relationship in a more benign fashion, for which some preparations seem to have been made at some level, it seems, in recent weeks. Or he plays the nationalist card domestically and becomes much more assertive, believing that's the best way to, as it were, consolidate his domestic political position if it takes damage because of the decisions over Putin in February. But your on-balance judgment, if I've read you right, Henry, is the former rather than the latter, that he would seek a new opening with America. And we may see something of that, you think, when the two leaders sit down in Bali on the margins of the G20 next month. Am I reading you correctly on that?
That's a correct summary of my view. Quite accurate. But I would also emphasize we should remain internally, in terms of our domestic discussions of the future of world order, in a state of mind that one keeps us strong enough to prevent being overwhelmed or dictated to, but also insightful enough so that we can create the possibility of an evolution that systematically attempts to eliminate the dangers that modern technology imposes on us, and whose automaticity needs to be controlled in some fashion.
We've got about 10 minutes or so left, and you've been generous with your time. Turning to Biden and Xi meeting in Bali next month, I've written about something called managed strategic competition, strategic guardrails, non-lethal competition, and the rest of the relationship beyond Taiwan and the usual strategic red lines and flashpoints, and even room for collaboration, climate and the rest. And you've talked about not just coexistence, but co-development, and I think your preferred term is co-evolution. So if you're sitting in the Oval Office at the moment with President Biden, or you're sitting in Zhongnanhai with Xi Dada, Xi Jinping, then what would be the line of advice that you would provide them about how to stabilize this relationship?
Well, people here whom I can't see because of the lights.
They're just friends. There's 2 or 3 of them there. Yes.
Ought to understand that I may be able to analyze a problem correctly without putting on the table by my own efforts a total plan of what to do. But I have had, I think, something like the following needs to happen. The 2 leaders in their conversations with each other, and one of them should be the first to say so, is we have a lot of problems and we cannot help impinging on each other around the world. But we ought to come to an agreement that we will not permit actions that we knowingly, which we know will lead to war between us. And we ought to agree among ourselves that this will be a guiding principle, and that we are going to set up some system. For example, a group on each side assigned that task, reporting directly to us. That would have the benefit, and it would even be conceivable that this be done on a track 1.5 level that is not fully governmental, to permit some flexibility in exploration. starting with the assumption that neither side can be defeated by subterfuge and without noticing it, and that we will attempt to deal with it in this manner. It may not work, but some dialogue has to be created other than what is now going on, which is very rare and always based on mutual accusations and no concrete proposals of what to do about it. And if one attempts to deal with Taiwan directly, it becomes an insoluble issue in the domestic politics of each side. So suspending informally provocative statements by either side for a period or permanently would be, in my view, the best way to permit its existence as an autonomous entity, as it has for 50 years, without forcing the Chinese into excessive acts or us into excessive statements. But this is the philosophy with which I would recommend approving it. But it's not a political plan. For that one needs staffs to do that more fully.
So, Henry, you've written another book, Leadership: 6 Studies in World Strategy. It's a New York Times bestseller. How are the sales going?
They're always inadequate for
Amazon, Henry's book, subscribe, buy when you get out of here. But I'm reliably informed that your sales are much better than mine for my book, so why am I not surprised by that? But you study these 6 leaders. In reflecting on their role and your own role between China and the United States over the last 50 years, how do you conceive of your own role today? And how have you conceived it?
Of course, studying the nature of American foreign policy has been my life's activity for over 70 years now. But in beginning to learn about the technology of the period and beginning to understand the nature of the Chinese cultural approach to its role in the world, I have tried to understand the Chinese. And on my first visit to China, where we had a whole list of complaints and issues, of course, with Nixon's approval, I concentrated on mostly abstract problems because I thought it would be the beginning of if it succeeded, of a long conversation. And therefore to list all our grievances. And one can see that in the text. For example, we still had troops in Taiwan, and I said, we can't talk about removing them until the Vietnamese War ends. So to link our problems, but I never said that publicly. And so I have tried to convey my understanding, regardless of what administration was in office, of American trends to the Chinese, and what I learned from the Chinese to the Americans. And I did not come after I left office with any immediate decisions to be made, but left it open to extensive presentations. And I've done that with every administration on our side and on their side. And so that's the level at which I may or may not have contributed.
Last question for me is, you've got a team of young aspiring diplomats and some not so young but still aspiring diplomats here with the Centre for China Analysis, the Asia Society Policy Institute. You've had a remarkably successful career, formerly as America's chief diplomat, but also in post-political life as America's senior unofficial diplomat. What's your advice to junior woodchucks like me and my team about how to continue to have an effect, a useful effect?
If you look at my life, and you would try to write a plan to get through its various stages, you would never dare to do that, because I was in politics, insofar as I was in politics. The person I was most closely associated with, and who was a close personal friend, was Nelson Rockefeller. So you wouldn't expect that this is a road to become security advisor to Richard Nixon, whom I had never met, and to whom, in fact, I was opposed, even if I never was in a public role. And Nelson Rockefeller, when Nixon offered me that position, I, from a career point of view, made the foolish mistake of saying, I have to discuss this with Nelson Rockefeller. So if any of you want to have a career, never do that. And Nixon told me, take a week. My request didn't deserve that, but that's whatever. So then I went to Nelson, and Nelson said, has it ever occurred to you that Nixon is taking a much bigger chance on you than you on him? And so that was the inspiration to accept it immediately, as I should have done. And I said it only to say, the best advice I can give for a career is to do what most moves you at the moment and engage in it substantially, and not keep an eye out for opportunities for advancement, but because the world has become so uncertain that your predictions, that you cannot predict the future, but you can predict your actions. So that is what I say to people, young young people who ask me what they can learn from my life. But I don't even say that's universally valid. That is my strong view.
Well, it's not a bad strong view to have. So the moral of the story is the Rockefeller name hangs over both of us. Nelson in your case, John D. Rockefeller III in our case here at the Asia Society. Henry Kissinger, thank you so much for being our guest at the Asia Society. Good. We will move off stage and then we'll resume our panels in about 10 minutes or so. So please bear with us. Good, Henry, we can move off. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this inaugural discussion of the Centre for China Analysis here at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Earlier today we had an official opening with Dr. Henry Kissinger, and we thought we'd get down to business by beginning to discuss the important issues which are on the table today. One of which, of course, is to make sense of what's unfolding and will unfold yet from the 20th Party Congress in terms of China's political economy. And we will have a good seminar on this now. We'll also be looking at the question of U.S. China relations and the possibilities of managed or unmanaged strategic competition. And in the great tradition of yin and yang, we will then move to a more rounded view of can we still collaborate with China in a whole series of other domains, including on climate and including on global public health. But I'd like to extend, as President and CEO of the Asia Society, a welcome to each and every one of you to what is a good day for the Asia Society, good day for the Asia Society Policy Institute, and the creation of this new centre within the Institute, the Centre for China Analysis. And so, over to you, Susie. Look forward to it.
To you all for this, the afternoon's first panel to mark the launch of the Asia Society's Center for China Analysis. I'm Susan Jakes. I'm the editor of the online magazine China File, and our topic for the next 40 minutes or so is the upcoming 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, which begins later this month. During the Congress, we will learn the names of the 25 men and possibly women, who as members of the party's Politburo will assume leadership of the country. We'll also find out who will be among the much smaller number of people, most likely just 7, most likely just men, who will sit on the Politburo's standing committee at the fulcrum of political power in China.
Are you saying, Susie, that it's a male-dominated party?
It is a bit. See our website for details. And they will become China's supreme leaders at a time when the country faces a host of complex challenges, both domestically and in terms of China's relationship with other parts of the world. The Congress will also mark Xi Jinping's bid for reappointment to a third 5-year term as the CCP's General Secretary, advancing the changes that he began in 2018 when he pushed through an amendment to China's constitution, allowing him to serve as president, that is, head of state, for longer than his immediate predecessors, and perhaps setting the scene to rule the country more indefinitely. Who China's new leaders may be, how they will relate to one another, and what their selection will mean for the future shape of China's politics and economy is the topic of our discussion today. But before I introduce this highly distinguished panel, I want to note that Decoding China's 20th Party Congress is not only the name of this panel, but also of an evolving digital tool and collection of analysis that our panelists, along with CCA's Managing Director Chen Jing and Assistant Director Nathan Levine, have just published. On Asia Society's website, you can find this amazing tool, and it allows you to explore the likely candidates for the Politburo and the many layers of connection among them, who went to school with whom, whose ancestors hail from the same province, which ones worked on which pieces of the policy portfolio, and so on. And these are all factors, these are all characteristics that may play some role in who's ultimately selected and then how they will rule. So when this panel is over, and as it inevitably will, it leaves you wanting much more, I encourage you to go out into the lobby where we have computers set up so that you can explore this tool, or to do so when you get home tonight. On to the panel. So arrayed before you are 4 preeminent experts on the subject of politics in China. Asia Society's president and CEO, the Honorable Dr. Kevin Rudd, Chris Johnson, a longtime analyst of China's leadership politics, both inside and outside of U.S. government, who now serves as the Center for China Analysis Senior Fellow for Domestic Politics. Ma Guonan, who is CCA's Senior Fellow for the Economy and served for many years at the Bank of International Settlement. And last but not least, Wu Guoguang, who is also a Senior Fellow for Domestic Politics. And on top of his other distinctions, is the only one among us, probably the only person in this room, who has seen a party congress from the inside when he helped prepare for the 13th Party Congress, which he says is ancient history, but I think also quite relevant. I remember when I first arrived in Beijing 20 years ago, just on the eve of the 16th Party Congress, and I was puzzling about how I was going to cover it. As a journalist, I called up my editor, and he said, well, before you do anything else, call Wu Guoguang. So it's especially nice to have him. That's also ancient history. That was in the Jiang Hu era. So now we're going to just get into it. And I think we're going to start with you, Kevin. The keen listeners among you, or anybody who was here for our earlier panel, will know that Kevin has recently added a new honorific to his fairly extensive collection. He's now Dr. Kevin Rudd, and Oxford University bestowed this title upon him in recognition of his deep immersion over the past several years in the thought and political philosophy of Xi Jinping, a hobby that is, let's just say, not for the faint of heart, which I think is also the title of your autobiography, right? Yeah. But which has led him to remarkable insights about both the substance and the function of ideology in Xi Jinping's hands and the degree to which it's central to governance in China today. So Kevin, I just want to start by asking you to give us an overview of how ideology will play a role in the Congress and what it's likely to mean for the practice of governance going forward.
Good, thanks, Susie. We're all dating our antiquity. 13th Party Congress, 16th Party Congress. What was your first Party Congress that you covered? Okay, I was there for the 12th. Well, actually, not exactly the 12th Party Congress, but between the 12th and the 13th. Remember the Special Party Congress of 1984? 85? 85. So there you go. I have a 12th in front of my credentials. That makes us all antiques up here, apart from Susie. A few words on ideology and why it matters. We became accustomed in the period of Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao to think that ideology was largely dead. That Marxism-Leninism as an ideology was a piece of, shall we say, camouflage over the top of what was becoming a rambunctious, rolling, basically Chinese semi-capitalist, state capitalist economy with episodic experiments in one form of political liberalization or another, mostly unsuccessful, sometimes partially successful, sometimes within the party, sometimes within the public, and a gradually opening Chinese society as well. That, in the argument in the dissertation I've just written at Oxford, that age comes to an end with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is China's ideologist-in-chief, and he takes ideology and the ideology of Marxism-Leninism seriously. And because of that, you see this reflected in so many things that he does. My summary comment, and then I'm more interested, Susie, and I'm sure the audience is, in hearing from the other experts in the field, is that if you trace back over the last 10 years, he's made 3 ideological changes. Number one, for reasons of party preservation for the long term, he's moved Chinese politics towards the Leninist left in order to re-entrench the power of the party over the totality of the economy and society, rather than being at the margins, which is where it was going under previous general secretaries. And that furthermore, within that, he has asserted the centrality of his leadership over the collective leadership. That's one big ideological shift. The second is in his second term in particular, from 2017 to the present, he's moved the center of gravity of Chinese economic policy to the Marxist left. Greater role for the state over the economy, greater role for SOEs, a more constrained role for the private sector, a wholesale assault on tech platforms, the property sector, parts of finance, and a new common prosperity agenda. And a rebirth of industrial scale planning backed up by massive industrial development funds, which have reconsolidated the power of the central planners in the system. And in my argument, flowing through to policy, has led in one respect to slowing Chinese economic growth. And the third ideological change in what I describe as Xi Jinping's overall ideological project of Marxist nationalism, if he's pushed politics to the left through Leninism, the economy to the left through Marxism, he's pushed nationalism to the right through a more assertive foreign and security policy. And we've seen this unfold really since about 2014 and with growing intensity as Deng's old doctrine of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead, has yielded to a new Xi Jinping doctrine of striving for achievement, changing the regional and global status quo in a manner more compatible with China's national interests and values. Concluding point from me is that why does ideology matter? It doesn't just matter because it matters to Xi Jinping. It matters because if you look at the history of the show from 1921 and certainly from 1949, when there is a profound ideological change at the top, it becomes the headwaters of subsequent policy change in the real world of economic policy and other forms of foreign policy as well. We saw that in the Deng period, where Deng basically said, stop disputing ideology, 不争论, and instead get on with the practical business of developing the economy. And that became the organizing principle for 35 years. What this guy has said is that ideology is back on top, Marxism and Leninism in particular. And what we see is that when that change occurs at the top, that it does flow through to the rest of policy beneath as well. And that, I think, is why when we look at the 20th Party Congress, my core focus for the analysis will be the ideological content of Xi Jinping's work report to the Congress and what the textual changes will be in that report compared with the 19th and 18th Party Congresses which preceded it. So there you go. That's my initial thought.
I think that sets us up well. I think let's save the policy piece for a minute. And Chris, maybe I can ask you to pick up on the first of the uses of ideology that Kevin identified. You know, we've watched over the last several months as rumors, some of them seemingly based on deep information, some of them based on much less information, have swirled around Xi's relative grip on power and whether it's slipping. And I wonder if maybe you can respond a little bit to what Kevin said, but also give us your sense of how you're reading where Xi is sitting right now, to the extent it's even possible.
For those of us, who've been doing this for a long time, arguably this is the most puzzling pre-conference period that we've had in some time, in part because we're entering uncharted waters with him likely staying around for a third term. So in previous last couple of episodes of this film that we've seen, a leader is departing, a new one is coming, right? And that obviously sets the table in a very unique way. This time, the key leader is staying. So in my mind, a lot of the bits and pieces that we're all usually so focused on, such as what will the Standing Committee look like, what will the Politburo look like, they're fascinating from a China politics geek point of view, but I'm not sure they're as meaningful, you know, in terms of policy consequences as they have been historically. And to pick up on Kevin's point about ideology, and this is, in my opinion, why I don't think Xi Jinping is on shaky ground at all politically, is that if he's had a masterstroke, it was to begin in a very methodical way this campaign of ideological aggrandizement for himself personally, putting aside the policy aspects that Kevin had mentioned. And that started almost immediately when he took power in 2012 by framing the history of the CCP in these three epochs, right? You know, the period under Mao, the period of Deng and those other guys that we don't talk about anymore, and then the Xi Jinping's new era, right? Each roughly about 30 years, which says something about what the Xi Jinping's new era will be like, so I think that's very valuable. And then obviously getting his eponymous contribution, Xi Jinping thought for horribly long name, as I like to call it, into the party constitution in 2017 is a big deal for a number of reasons. One, it speaks to his personal power. But two, as Kevin was alluding to earlier, it makes it much more difficult within their system to oppose the policies of that leader if they have that ideological standing, because you're no longer attacking Xi Jinping as an individual or the party secretary, you're attacking the party's line. And that's a very dangerous game within their system. You can do it, but you better win if you're going to do it. And I expect that similarly at the 20th Party Congress, he will achieve truncating that horribly long name just down to Xi Jinping thought. And that would put him, of course, on a par with only Mao Zedong, right? And then in my mind, it becomes even more difficult for folks to push back on policy. So when we saw rumors over the spring and just constantly really for the last several years, but particularly in the spring where this idea of after a series of policy setbacks, and Kevin and Dr. Kissinger spoke about the Russia piece, which I agree with all their commentary, zero COVID, these controversial policies that he's been pursuing, that somehow there was a notion that pushback was occurring, or worse, even that people were taking the fight to Xi Jinping. And in my mind, I've seen no evidence to suggest that that's happening. There's a lot of people who don't like Xi Jinping and who grumble about him ceaselessly within the system. My focus as an analyst is, does it meaningfully move the dial on policy? And in my opinion, I'm not seeing anything that has thus far.
All right, well, then that's a good excuse to move to the policy front itself. In addition to the challenges that Chris just mentioned that are going to face this new group of leaders, the economic picture has been somewhat choppy over the last year. There's issues in the real estate market, youth unemployment, a variety of other issues. I wonder if you could just talk to us a little bit about what kinds of economic policies we're likely to see in the coming months, and how they're related to what's actually going to take place in October, if at all.
Thank you. Yes, despite some tentative and hopeful signs of economic stabilization emerging in the past few weeks, based on my latest reading of the data, the Chinese economy has been struggling, to say the least, and at one point has been fairly gloomy. Mostly owing to a combination of very ugly and adverse shocks to the economy. Some of these shocks are externally imposed, not much you can do. For example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as the ongoing trade and technology tension with the U.S. But in my view, at least this year, most of the shocks to the Chinese economy came from the domestic front. One is the rapidly aging population. Another is the excessive leverage in the property sector, in the Chinese property sector. But however, there's a crucial difference between the property rules in China now and the property rules in the US 10, 15 years ago in the subprime crisis. The excessive leverage in the US 15 years ago, property leverage has more to do with the home buyer, whereas in China, it's been mostly related to the property developers themselves. So there's a crucial distinction there. But there's a lot of linkage, common linkage between these two crises as well, so I won't have to spend time on it. Most importantly, some of the adverse shocks we are seeing so far this year has been policy-induced by the government itself. These policies, say, for example, includes the very stringent zero-COVID measures, which is very costly, very painful. The abrupt enforcement of the 3 red lines on the financing or leveraging of the property developers, and the very hasty and very erratic regulatory reset over the mostly private technology platform sector, as mentioned by Kevin. So the question is that as the Party Congress approaches, what would be the likely interaction between the politics on the one hand and economics on the other? My view is that's getting trickier and less favorable. On the one hand, poor economic performance will undermine or at least weaken the legitimacy of the current party leadership. On the other hand, on the eve of the Party Congress, it also becomes harder to meaningfully adapt the signature economic policy China nowadays adopted. Nobody dare to make a major move, even on the economic front. So hence, both politics and economics become straitjacket together. No one dare to boldly offer competing but potentially more pragmatic economic advice. And this will only make the economy even harder to manage, which in turn probably will add to the political tension internally. So the next question will be that after Party Congress, what may be the overall economic policy regime going forward? I see 2 possible paths going forward. As economists, you always say things on the one hand and on the other. So the good path is a less rigid and more pragmatic policy making, which typically features an enhanced role for the private sector and the market as well, because the market has to be more efficient in terms of resources allocation, and private sector is the more dynamic.
好吗？就是近一点。
Sorry. And the market tends to be more efficient in terms of resources allocation. The private sector tends to be the most dynamic. When you have these 2 things going on, then economic challenge can be better managed. But the bad parts will be even blunter, more rigid, even more corner solution type of economic policy we are seeing more and more often in recent years, which tend to be associated more closely with bigger state roles and even strong personal view as well. So the newly chosen economic team may provide some hint as to which policy paths we are likely to see going forward. One final observation, most of the observers, China observers here will agree that it used to be the case that economic development is or if not, among the top priority for China. But in recent years, the importance of economic development appears to have ranked noticeably lower on more and more occasions. I would stop here.
In relation to what? What's rising? If
To any other policy goal.
Okay. All right. Well, Wu Guoguang, you're going to be left with the task of sort of tying this all together. But I wonder, Chris says, and this is my analysis too, that there are a lot of people who don't necessarily like Xi Jinping very much. We may have a struggling environment for nimble economic policy change. What is this likely to mean for this new up-and-coming, and when we say up-and-coming, we don't really mean young people, but different new generation of Chinese leaders who are about to assume responsibility for this pretty complicated and challenging picture? And
thank you, Susie. That's really a thoughtful question because it highlights one of those key issues confronting the 20th Party Congress. To my point of view, Xi's continues staying in power, for the 3rd term at least, and also the composition of the next top leadership, particularly the Politburo Standing Committee, and who will be the Prime Minister. That's the second key question. And the third one is just what you tried to highlight, the generational renewal of CCP elite, particularly mid-level, high-level elite. Actually, in our preliminary studies, we found that the average age of current ministerial level, vice ministerial level CCP cadres, the average age of them today is much higher than that of them peers 10 years ago and also 20 years ago. So basically, based on the statistics of the last reshuffling of the provincial party standing committee, among those 315 so-called provincial standing committee members, except party secretary and governor. So only 69, they were born in the 1970s. So roughly 22% of those guys, they were born in the 1970s. I don't have actually similar statistics available for how about the situation 10 years ago, but 20 years ago. But I can give you some personal, stories of those leaders' personal careers. For example, Li Keqiang, he became full minister in his age of 38. And Zhao Leji became deputy governor, provincial governor in 37. Wang Yang became deputy provincial governor in 38. And also the latecomer Xi Jinping, actually, he became deputy provincial governor in 43. And all of them, they became provincial governors or party secretaries in their 40s. And today, the youngest provincial governor in China, Zhao Long in Fujian province, he was born in 1967. You can calculate how old he is. 55 already, and he became provincial governor only in the last year. And also the youngest provincial party secretaries in today's China, 4 of them, they were born in 1964. So they became party provincial secretary. Only the most senior became party secretary province of Shanxi before the last year.
And what do you think this is about? Why are such elderly leaders being chosen?
So why this gap of age like this? So basically, I think because when Xi Jinping came into power, actually all around him, those young people who were promoted by Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. So basically, in long term, there are 3 high tide of generational renewal of CCP leading cadres at this level, just like Kevin mentioned in mid-1980s. So that special party congress renewed the Politburo with promotion of a lot of younger leaders, including those, Wu Bangguo, Hu Jintao, those guys. And in late 1990s, when Jiang Zemin consolidated his power, he promoted a lot of young guys to these levels. Those people, Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, they got opportunity in that wave. And the third one, with Hu Jintao, of course, because Hu Jintao, his power base is with Communist Young League. And those young guys, they got advantage with this career. And so when Xi Jinping came to power, so all around him, I don't know these guys actually. So he needed to renew the elite. But he didn't want to, those guys were really in advantage because of their ages. So Xi Jinping's basic strategy of elite circulation was to block those younger guys' career rather than promote young people. So usually we think that younger age is really beneficial factor for political career. Yes, early birds get the worms. But you can also imagine that the early worms, how they actively fate. They are eaten by birds. So Xi Jinping is that big bird, eating those early worms promoted by Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. So that's why story like today. So also, you know the case, the youngest Politburo member, Sun Zhengcai, 5 years ago. Yeah, just because he was the youngest guy, so he was purged. I guess also, of course, easy to find excuse to purge him, corruption, things like that.
I want to come back to the rest of you, but I just want to press on this a little more. What do you imagine is going to happen now?
Yeah.
Are some of these younger people going to finally be elevated, or have they just been?
Yeah, back to the 20th Party Congress, the youngest Politburo member, actually 3 of them, they were born in early 1960s. If the Communist Party still follows the rule of age ceiling, so-called 七上八下, when you got 67 years old, you could continue your term, and 68, you have to retire. That means for the next, not 20th Party Congress, 5 years later, only 3 guys, they would stay in power. That could be big gap, actually, in terms of a continuous power governance, things like that. So in terms of this, we can speculate that for the 20th Party Congress, at least 5 or even some more of younger guys who were born in the 1960s would be promoted into Politburo. And for the lower levels, I would like to say in the next 5 years, if Xi Jinping really consolidates his power through this 20-party Congress, and he will try to promote a lot of younger guys to higher positions, maybe that can be predicted. I will stop here. Thank you.
That's very interesting. I thought we could we just have a few more minutes, but I thought we could do a little bit of a lightning round. I'm a journalist, and so one of the things that strikes me so much when I have a conversation like this, or when I read the work that you have published on the Asia Society website, is just how little information we actually have about any of this, and you all do an amazing job with little information and using it to derive quite astute analysis. But I just wonder, I wanted to ask each of you, if there were one piece of information right now that you could get your fingers on that would help you clarify your analysis of what is happening in Beijing right now, what would it be? I'll start with you.
Well, given I'm the ideology guy here,
You have volumes of things to read. Maybe you have too much.
No. The ideology stuff I think is important, and I'll make this lightning roundish. As I said before, what I'd really like to have my hands on now is the draft of the ideology statement at the 20th Party Congress, which seeks to build on what the 19th Party Congress said was the central, quote, contradiction or the central challenge of the party for the period ahead, 主要的矛盾. Because last time round, that represented a significant correction to the left, which gave rise to all the subsequent policies that I believe we have seen. But the other one that I'm looking for, Susie, at the ideological level is, was the 20th Party Congress report going to contain a continuation of the phrase used since 2002, which is that China is in a period of strategic opportunity, 战略机遇期, or will it be removed? I suspect it will be removed, and that we'll have a new phraseology which will point to China's formal ideological conclusion, using their own dialectical analysis, that it is an adverse strategic environment that they now face, and which, without wishing to sound too dramatic, begins to put the party and the country, therefore, on a level of military preparedness for future contingencies. I'm looking for that, and I wish I had access to it now, and for me.
Chris?
I would want to know 2 things, because I think it's fundamentally important, and I think it's the things we're all scratching our heads about. The first is, when will they end the zero COVID policy? And the second is, how will they change their approach on wolf warriorism in their foreign policy? And I think it's important on a number of fronts. The first, of course, is, as I mentioned earlier, Xi Jinping isn't going anywhere, right? So we're sort of in this position now, and I think I have a slightly different view than Guo Guang. My view is that he consolidated power at the latest in 2017. I actually think he consolidated power before that. So these iterations have been really the further articulation of his leadership supremacy in my mind. So we need to know, does this guy have what we might call ideational flexibility to be able to change these policies? So in my mind, that's very important. And to Kevin's point about the period of strategic opportunity, I believe that for a long time as well. In fact, Xi Jinping has effectively been undermining it since his first Foreign Affairs Work Conference in 2014. The speech there began to question that. He's built his entire power, and it's helped him justify the power grab that he's done by creating a sense of urgency and even danger in the international environment. All of his speeches are full of it. So that then would suggest to me that we won't know about this wolf warriorism. We're more likely to see consistency. But those two issues, ending zero COVID and the wolf warriorism, because as we all do, when we see them doing things that don't make sense, from a Western point of view, or even from just a conventional wisdom point of view, we have to ask ourselves two questions. What do they know, or perhaps better, what do they assess that we do not, that make them think these things are smart? And oftentimes I think it is their dialectical mindset that leads them to these conclusions. Or the second one is, have they begun to believe so much in their asymptotic rise and so on and so forth that they don't realize they're making these policy mistakes? And to Kevin's point, I think that's a much more dangerous spot for all of us.
One favorite tea leaves I am watching closely in the Chinese economy is to look at the advertisements put up by the local governments regarding
Advertisements.
Put up by the local governments regarding the long-term franchise or operating rights of their local operations, including, for example, parks or even the cafeteria of the local government. 30 years of operating rights. And people will ask, why they're doing that? So one possible explanation is it's a sign of looming fiscal stress at all levels of the government. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Okay. If you just start talking, it will automatically.
Yes, I'll be very brief. Yeah. So actually, it's a really big challenge to us to understand Chinese politics. I would say experience doesn't matter. Actually, because as I mentioned, you experience only in the past, and everything changed. You know that China is in the new era of Xi Jinping, so the logic could be fundamentally different. And also, a lot of social science knowledges could be, I don't know. I would say seems that China challenges social science studies. But still, I feel that there is a joke saying that there are two kinds of logic in the world, the logic and also the Chinese logic. So actively, I found that, I got political science training in this country. So I found that this training is really helpful for me to, when I look back at my experience in China, I got a lot of things. When I was in Beijing, I didn't understand, but Western training really helps. So actively, I would say we can actively use, for example, Chris just mentioned something about the power. Actively, power logic, is something Chinese leadership particularly follows. So I got theory about international realism, things like that, and those kind of things. Machiavelli understands power logics much, much better than Confucius. So actively, that really helps. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all
Can
of
I
you.
throw a question across, because I know we've got to finish? You just mentioned having been trained in China. Chris just mentioned, and I mentioned before, dialectical training, dialectical thinking. In your training, and two logics, to what extent is Chinese logic Confucian or dialectical in the way in which they look and observe current reality? And how do either of those traditions fundamentally differ from the Western tradition you've been trained in? I'm quite interested in that difference. Sorry.
great question.
I would say both logics, Confucian logic and Machiavellic logic, they apply to understanding China pretty well. I guess, I don't know, Western society are basically operating following Machiavellic logic. But China actually likes to play so-called two-phase, generous actively phase strategy. So in daily life, in public conversation, everybody use moral norms to understand everything, to treat each other. But behind, they use Machiavellian logic to treat each other. So if we understand how these two different logics, they apply to different occasions of Chinese politics, maybe better we can understand Chinese politics. That's my only really 2 cents.
Satisfied? Okay. Well, thanks so much to all of you, and I encourage all of you to keep an eye on the Center for China Analysis, where you will soon find writing from all of these gentlemen.
All right, everybody. All right. Thank you. We're going to, yes, right. We're going to move. All right. Welcome once again, everyone. We're going to move right on into our next panel, being very conscious of time. This next panel is entitled Building Guardrails in the U.S. China Strategic Relationship After the 20th Congress and in the run-up to the Biden-Xi Summit, which is expected in the next several weeks. We're going to try to take about 40 minutes and keep to time. I'm really, really happy to have a fantastic group of folks up here on the panel, all of them associated with our new center. We have Dr. Evan Medeiros, who is a professor at Georgetown University and a former senior-most Asia advisor to President Obama in the White House National Security Council. We're also very pleased to have with us Rory Daniels, who is the managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute. We have Lyle Morris, who's just joined us as a senior fellow in foreign policy pillar for our center, and formerly an official within the Pentagon, and also a lengthy period of time working as a researcher at the RAND Corporation. And last and certainly not least, Andrew Chubb, who hails originally from Australia, now based at the University of Lancaster in the UK, who's going to be joining the center as a fellow also within our foreign policy and national security pillar. Let me begin with you, Evan. I hope you could set the scene for us a little bit. what's your take then on what the key foreign policy and national security issues are going to be coming out of the 20th Party Congress? Do you foresee much change? And maybe speak a bit to some of the comments we heard in the previous panel. Are we likely to see a signaling coming out of the Congress about challenges in terms of China's international standing, its place in the world, and where the leadership would like China to be, say, in 5 or 10 years?
Well, thank you very much, Bates. I want to begin by thanking you and Kevin Rudd for standing up this center. I think it's a truism in life that doing good things with great people is a fantastic opportunity. And when I heard that I could work with an American who lives in Australia and an Australian that lives in America, I thought this was too great an opportunity to pass up. So thanks to both of you for doing this. I look forward to many years of fruitful collaboration. So what's going to be on the foreign policy agenda coming out of the Party Congress? Three words come to mind. The first is personnel, the second is policy, and the third is perceptions. In terms of personnel, there will very likely be a substantial turnover in the top foreign policy leadership. Xi Jinping's top 2 advisors, Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi, have been on the foreign policy scene at senior levels for at least 15 years and longer. When I was in the Obama White House, Yang Jiechi, of course, was the foreign minister. Wang Yi headed the Taiwan Affairs Office, and then both of them subsequently moved up at the last Party Congress. So we're going to see very likely a changeover, and we don't know who their successors are. And the bench is not a terribly deep bench. Many of us sit around rooms of sinologists guessing at who the next Chinese foreign minister will be at a time of very substantial global crisis. So I think personnel and who's going to lead the Chinese foreign policy establishment, who's going to advise Xi Jinping, absolutely is at the top of the agenda. And I could rattle off a few names that are the likely candidates, but these are not people that are particularly well known. And you could say similar things about changes in Chinese economic policy, which are directly linked to foreign policy, given the fact that China is the second largest economy in the world. And of course, what China does economically directly or indirectly affects global markets. So I think personnel is going to be a big piece to watch, and understanding who will succeed Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi is key. Number 2 is policy, right? What are the policy priorities of Xi Jinping going to be coming out of the Party Congress? And that's the document, to answer Susie's question from the last panel, that's the document that I'd like to see. What are the 20th Party Congress foreign policy priorities going to be? I mean, I think China right now, given what's happening in the world, a world of course, war in Ukraine, international economy that's going through both deglobalization and fragmentation, the fact that energy markets globally are being completely rewired. There are huge challenges to the non-proliferation regime. When I look at the global or the geopolitical landscape, it's facing a lot of big challenges. And I think for China, there's some decision points, tensions, or trade-offs that they face. I think one of them is integration versus isolation. We've been hearing a lot from the Chinese government about efforts captured most recently in the 14th Five-Year Plan, where they talk about dual circulation or rewiring the Chinese economy to reduce China's dependence on others, but increase others' dependence on China. And the fact that there was a national security chapter in the last 5-year plan was striking. I think that may be a first. And the fact that they're increasingly, to Kevin's point from the earlier panel, beginning to see the world increasingly in terms of an ideologically informed competition that is now shaping economic policy. And the question becomes, is China going to be able to grow, given the multiple cascading macroeconomic challenges they face? Will they be able to grow in an environment where Xi Jinping is trying to re-engineer or engineer an economy that is more self-reliant, right? I mean, it goes back to the, Mao used to talk about this all the time. Now, I don't think China is on a pathway to Maoist autarky. That's not my argument. But when China faces so many economic challenges at the same time, and yet Xi Jinping wants them to become more self-reliant, wants to emphasize technology, innovation, et cetera. I just don't know how they do it all at the same time. And so I think there's a bit of a trade-off between integration and isolation. And I think there's another big policy trade-off, which is leadership versus alienation. I think if the last 10 years of Chinese foreign policy has demonstrated anything, it's that Xi Jinping is clearly comfortable using Chinese power. But the issue is the way Xi Jinping has sought to use Chinese power, economic power, military power, they've certainly tried to use discourse power, is it comes across pretty coercively and has led to a fairly high degree of alienation. This is something that you cover very articulately in your new book, Bates. And so the question is, can China find a balance between leading without alienating, or is the only way for it to use its power result in blowback and pushback in a way that will just create even more alienation by the rest of the world? The latest Pew polls, I think, are pretty interesting. There's a new Pew study out on global attitudes toward China, more in the developed world than the developing world. And admittedly, we need more data on the developing world. And I know Andrew's going to be doing a lot of great work with us on that. So I think leading and alienating. And then there's new issues on the Chinese agenda. I mean, I think I read a statistic that something like 15 economies in the world in the next 3 years are going to face sovereign debt crises, and that China is the top creditor for all of them. And so that's going to put China even more at the center of global economic discussions. I've got some colleagues in the business school at Georgetown that are actually, very, very knowledgeable about how China works with creditor countries. And, China is not a member of the Paris Club. China is not a member of the London Club. And I think that China figuring out what role it wants to play and how that positions China in the international community is going to be a real challenge. And then the final issue is one of perceptions. And here the point is really about domestic politics. And what I worry about is Chinese foreign policy increasingly is affected by China's own domestic politics, in particular the priorities that she articulates at home, in particular this sort of national security outlook in which he has framed foreigners and foreign influences as an innate risk and seeks to reduce exposure to those, relating back to my earlier point about integration versus isolation. And then I worry about the U.S. China relationship, a relationship where domestic politics in both countries seems to be having an outsized impact on how the relationship is managed. And if we enter into a world where domestic politics in both Beijing and Washington, more than national interest calculations or geopolitical calculations, are driving the U.S.-China relationship, that's a world in which governments have far less agency. So I'm focused on personnel, I'm interested in policy choices, in particular trade-offs, as they face contradictions, and then perceptions and politics in the United States and China.
Thanks very much, Evan. I mean, none of that bodes well, as far as I can read your analysis there, that all of them are major challenges, and it's not clear to me that they're going to be all that successful in getting through them, leading to a much more continuing contestation on our agenda with China going forward. And maybe there's no other question that's more contested. I wanted to hear from you on this, Rory. And we get into some of the policy issues more specifically, is Beijing's thinking towards Taiwan. And I wonder, is your read now that we're likely to see any changes as a result of the deliberations of the 20th Party Congress? Are we likely to see any changes in thinking towards Taiwan that might lend somewhat greater stability and a moderation to the conversation that's going to arise in the anticipated summit between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden?
Oh, thank you, Bates. I think that's a critical question, actually, is how to stabilize the U.S. China relationship, particularly over the issue of Taiwan. Wang Yi stood on this very stage just a couple of weeks ago and said that Taiwan was the issue that posed the greatest risk to U.S. China relations, and also called the 3 joint communiques between the U.S. and China the most critical guardrails in the relationship. So I think that that really encapsulates how important this issue is in the U.S. China relationship, at least to Beijing. In terms of the 20th Party Congress, I think Taiwan policy has been concentrated in Xi Jinping's hands for a very long time now. And under his leadership, Taiwan has become a focal, organizing, ideological point of narrative success for the Communist Party. So separation from Taiwan has been linked to, foreign humiliation, and reunification with Taiwan has been seen as a critical guidepost, if not the finish line, in national rejuvenation. So if in this process of the 20th Party Congress, Xi comes out of it, as many predict, as strong as he is today or stronger, then I expect Taiwan to continue to play that organizing role in the narrative arc of Communist Party success. But that tightening ideological control, I think, has really constrained Beijing's policy options when it comes to dealing with current events in and around Taiwan. So, and there are 2, I think, major decisions made out of Beijing that have shaped the environment for cross-strait relations that we see today. The first was the total cutoff of cross-strait official communications between Beijing and Taipei after Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP came to power in 2016. I mean, to me, this really unbalanced the triangular relationship between Washington, Taipei, and Beijing, and it forced the U.S. into much more of an active role in cross-strait relations as the entity that had relationships with both sides. The other decision was the just absolutely brutal handling of the Hong Kong protests, and the sense that gave to Taiwan people of what kind of one country, 2 systems framework, which has been Xi Jinping's framework for unification with Taiwan, that was going to be available to Taiwan after unification. And so not only did that galvanize support for the DPP inside Taiwan, but it also kind of reawakened a dormant nationalism inside the opposition KMT, and also, I think, rallied the international community around Taiwan autonomy and Taiwan's self-determination. So I think those 2 events have really shaped a much stronger and sharper threat perception of Beijing, both in Washington and Taipei and among the international community. So these are decisions that were ran certainly through Xi himself, and they can't be walked back, repudiated, re-examined in any way. So that really begs the question that if less ideology and more flexibility had been applied, would Beijing be in a different position today to kind of manage a pathway toward peaceful unification? Beijing's always said that peaceful unification was their policy goal, and I believe that will remain the policy preference, no matter what the outcome is of the 20th Party Congress. But the strategic question moving forward is whether that preference can hold if there are really no viable pathways to peaceful reunification. So I think in any upcoming leadership level meeting, if there's a summit, a sit down between President Biden and Xi Jinping, that Taiwan will certainly come up. I'm dead certain that it will come up. It will be the top of the agenda for Beijing, and that Beijing will seek reaffirmation from the U.S. that it does not support Taiwan independence or that it opposes Taiwan independence. But I think the U.S. should use this opportunity as well to probe Beijing on these pathways to peaceful reunification. If we look at the 2005 PRC anti-secession law, it holds out the use of force in 2 scenarios. The first is if Taiwan declares de jure independence or makes a formal declaration of independence. But the second is if all peaceful pathways to unification have been exhausted. So I think that this is a really important topic in the U.S.-China relationship, that the U.S. should ask Xi Jinping at the leadership level, what are the pathways that you see toward peaceful unification, and really probe and test that those are possible. It's going to be very difficult for all of the reasons that have been outlined in previous panels and discussions today to keep that conversation focused on stabilizing the relationship and to not devolve into a blame game of how we got into the situation that we're in today. But I think it is absolutely critical that the U.S. and China try to do that because I believe that it is the type of effort that could forestall a worst case scenario, which is a U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rory. Again, not a particularly optimistic take, and pointing out, I think, and I agree with you, a continued hardening of positions likely coming out of the Congress, certainly on the question of Taiwan. Some of your suggestions there, I think, resonated a bit with what I found to be one of the most interesting things that Henry Kissinger had to say, and that was that the two leaders need to say to one another, we're not going to do anything one against the other that would precipitate war. What immediately came to mind then is that, well, that means that Xi Jinping cannot use force to gain his preferred outcomes with regard to Taiwan, because that would almost certainly, at least in my view, would almost certainly or have a high likelihood of precipitating the kind of outcome that Henry Kissinger said we don't want to be going toward. And speaking of that, I think there's a question then for you, Lyle, because you study the Chinese military very carefully, and I'm just curious whether you see any interesting signals in relation to the 20th Party Congress that might tell us more about the trajectory that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is going to be taking going forward, or maybe put it another way, assuming that the modernization drive will continue. What's got you most concerned about that trajectory for China?
Thanks for the question, Bates, and thank you, Kevin Rudd, for assembling this incredible panel of experts. And I wish I could strike a more optimistic tone from what was said before, but unfortunately I can't. Based on my research of the PLA and based on my experience at DoD, I am concerned of the trends and where they're going, and I don't see those trends changing. In other words, I think the trajectory is going to continue on what I call a more muscular path of the PLA, and I think that Xi has consolidated control over the PLA in ways unseen since Mao. I think that's going to continue. I think he's done a pretty impressive job when it comes to consolidating his power with the PLA and with the military. Of course, we don't know who is going to be on the CMC. We don't know if there's going to be a whole changeover or who the vice chairmen are going to be. But I think who is going to be in Xi's ear when it comes to PLA issues is going to be tremendously important. So when I look at trend lines, I see basically things continuing the same as how they have been, which is I think China is going to continue to increase its military spending. I really think that China, if China could be more transparent about its military spending, it would not solve issues, but it would help. As we know, China's military spending is underreported, and much of what we see in the official expenditures is not reflected in reality. So I think things like being more open with its spending would help a bit. But I think Xi will continue his consolidation of the PLA, and I think that he has clearly made an effort to make it more joint with the theater commands. I think that's going to continue. I think that the PLA has very clear benchmarks to meet that, quite frankly, are very ambitious, 2027, 2035, and then 2049. The 2027 benchmark has been sort of a newly announced benchmark, and we're not really sure what that means, but we know it's the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PLA, so symbolically it's very significant. But I think that, quite frankly, the Pelosi visit and what we saw with what the PLA did in response with the exercises showed you where things could go and where they might be going, and which is that the PLA felt the need to respond very strongly militarily. And what that did was it gave countries in the region pause for what that means for stability in the region. So the U.S. is going to continue to have delegations going to Taiwan. I think that's clear. And so how will the PLA react when they've set this new kind of mark for how they would react militarily is a really important question. And I think, quite frankly, I think there's a lot of cause for concern because when you have political delegations going to Taiwan, whether it's not just from the US, but from other countries, and you see the PLA kind of respond that way, I think it puts countries, it gives them pause for whether they should proceed with unofficial relations with Taiwan. So I think by and large, things will continue apace. I think the military is going to continue to be bolstered, and a very large budget is going to continue. But again, I go back to the transparency thing. I think China put out their defense white paper, and it was helpful, but quite frankly, left a lot to be desired when it comes to the data that they gave. So, not to say that the U.S. Department of Defense is tremendously transparent when it comes to all our spending, but I think we do, try to publish data to show here's what our strategy is and here's why we're doing it. The more the PLA can be transparent would help at least have a conversation about their trajectory.
Well, maybe we can, later in the panel, if we have the time, we could get back to you on that, because I think you have some ideas about how we might have those sorts of conversations, officially and semi-officially, with the idea of the guardrails in mind. Andrew, you've done a lot of work on trying to measure or take stock of the question of assertiveness in China's foreign relations, and that's especially true, I know, with your work regarding the South China Sea. And we have to presume, of course, that Xi Jinping is going to be party chief for another term. And so how do you then read, on your assertion index, what would you predict a third term for Xi Jinping is likely to entail then? Is it going to be a doubling down? Is it going to be a sort of assumption of greater confidence and then maybe somewhat more accommodating posture? Do you join the rest of the panelists with a more pessimistic take on this assertiveness index going forward?
Thanks, Bates. I'll see what I can do about the optimism thing. I might rearrange some of the points that I had prepared. Thanks, first of all, for having me as part of this. It's a real pleasure. To the question about the South China Sea and assertiveness, I think what my research on this question has indicated is that assertiveness in the South China Sea is not a Xi Jinping thing. It's a matter of consensus. It goes right back to Jiang Zemin, and even before. Jiang Zemin was the one who first put forward the idea of building China into a maritime power, which is most closely associated with the Xi Jinping era, but was put forward by Jiang Zemin in 2000. China's behavior in the South China Sea quite clearly intensified in terms of both volume of assertive actions and the coercive quality under Hu Jintao, so well before Xi Jinping took power. And so on that basis, I don't think that there's a particular reason to expect that more sort of secure Xi Jinping would result in a change in China's level of assertiveness in the South China Sea. That said, consistent with the various other areas of domestic politics and international relations, Xi Jinping has been tightening control. Control over the Chinese Coast Guard, control over the PLA, and that has a couple of implications. On one hand, maybe this is a cause for optimism, it reduces ambiguity somewhat. So the actions that China's maritime actors take in disputed areas are much less likely to be the result of some lower level enterprising captain or lower level bureaucracies acting on their own volition. So maybe less ambiguity means that it's easier to have a conversation with the Chinese about how to handle particular situations. On the other hand, in fact, this is an optimistic point too. Perhaps a stronger Xi Jinping might have greater leeway for certainly not compromise. There's no indication that that's part of the agenda, but maybe moderation, if he was to think it to be in China's national interest. Further ahead, I think the question to watch is the impact of the lower economic growth that looks basically certain to bedevil China over the coming years, and the way that that could interact with South China Sea policy. I'll put the pessimistic scenario first. Started to see a lot more analysis starting to talk about potential diversionary scenarios for Xi Jinping coming under pressure in the future as a result of a period of sort of sustained low economic growth and maybe social problems as a result. I think looking at, if I'm Xi Jinping, I'm looking at the regional situation and I'm trying to pick a good spot for a diversionary conflict. I'm probably not thinking about the East China Sea where Japan is there. I'm probably not thinking about an attack on Taiwan as a diversion. I think the South China Sea is a much more appealing option from that point of view. On the other hand, and I'll end on this more optimistic note, the PRC doesn't really have a track record of surging in assertiveness when it's faced domestic problems before. What my research has indicated is that in previous times of severe economic troubles and acute legitimacy crises like 1976 and 1989 has actually brought about a temporary lull in the PRC's activities in these disputed areas as it's sort of sought to consolidate and focus more domestically. So if that passes for optimism, you can take that for what it is.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. That's a nice way of looking at it, I think. And I wanted to press you a little bit further as we turn now in our conversation to talk a little more specifically about what can we do to try to introduce guardrails or try to introduce some degree of greater stability, if it's possible, in the U.S. China relationship. And another interesting line of work that you're engaged in is looking at global public opinion toward China. And I'm curious, do you think that by raising awareness through your work and others about what the world is thinking toward China, do you think that sort of raising of awareness might serve as a tool or some kind of instrument to moderate Chinese policy? Does it matter, actually, to Chinese leaders what the world thinks of them? Or would it, at least at a minimum, help us outside of China to find leverage points and ways that we can try to bring some pressures to bear to seek greater moderation in China's policies?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is a question that I will be pursuing in the course of the Centre's research. I think we definitely need to know more about global public opinion towards China. As Evans mentioned, Pew's been following this for a couple of decades now, but the results are overwhelmingly skewed towards the developed world. So we need to know more about what the rest of the world thinks, both in China's region and also in other parts of the world. To the question of whether public opinion can restrain PRC conduct, I think there is a line of reasoning that you can follow, that knowing more about public sentiments, particularly in China's counterpart countries in some of these disputes that I've been studying, could help to give the PRC side pause for thought in some of the ways that they've handled, particularly in the area of publicity. So think of the THAAD dispute in South Korea, or with South Korea, I should say, over the U.S. Deployment of the THAAD missile system in 2016, 2017, and the PRC really sought to up the ante in the public opinion domain in that particular case. Ostensibly, the consensus view seems to be that this was an attempt to either mobilize pro-China or anti-US sentiments within Korea, and/or deter Korea from agreeing to subsequent moves of that nature. But what happened is, and you can see this in some of the polling that hasn't been put together with Pew yet, but from multiple Korean polling sources, is that public perceptions of China just absolutely crashed when China sought to have the dispute in a very public manner and bring Chinese nationalist sentiments into the dispute. And so on that basis, it's quite clear that that tactic has been counterproductive, and I think there's a number of other examples that we can look at as well that demonstrate this to the PRC side. So I think this is one reason to expect that paying more attention to public opinion could certainly, it's something that the PRC side needs to know more about. I'm not sure what their sources of information on their counterparts' public opinion is, but I think it's something that we probably can contribute to by bringing up and basically by studying it and by bringing out more data to be able to base conclusions on.
Thanks, Andrew. And we're really looking forward to that work that you're going to be doing on that, and we'll find out, won't we? Once you're able to get a little more work on that completed, we're looking forward to it. We have a little bit less than 10 minutes left to us today, and maybe in the spirit of Susie Jake's lightning round, I thought we could go one by one and talk about, maybe in your particular area of interest, what sort of mechanisms might be available to help strengthen either crisis management or communication, and especially in the absence of sustained track one, official discussions and dialogue, or at least if sustained, certainly strained nature of that dialogue. What sort of ideas would you have to try and introduce, if you could do so, to help build up guardrails and moderate this relationship in a way that points in a somewhat more stable direction? Let me start with Lyle, maybe with regard to military-related communications. And
thanks for that's I think is a crucially important question. Is how do we communicate with China? How does the U.S. and China communicate? And I think that first of all, we have existing communication channels. The U.S. and the DoD and the PLA and the White House and Zhongnanhai. And as I've argued recently with my colleague Colonel Kyle Markram, I think that those in the current environment is the best we're going to get. In other words, we don't have a Soviet-style red phone with China, and we're not going to get one anytime soon, I don't think. So what that means is we have modes of communication with China, but the problem is that China views them not in a narrow, practical, de-escalatory way. When I say China, I mean mostly the PLA. They look at that. They look at them in a broader perception of crisis management and politics. In other words, when China is upset about something geopolitically, they will choose to either not pick up the phone or let the phone ring, and just as a political signal that they're displeased with U.S. policy. So I think that the U.S. and China have much different perspectives on the utility of crisis communications, and this is one thing that I think that there's a lot of work that be done on, which is to find ways that are politically neutral ways to talk during a dispute. My worry, quite frankly, is that during a dispute over Taiwan is that we won't be able to talk rapidly in the beginning stages, and that will lead to misperception on both sides. So I think the bottom line for me is I think that the U.S. and China have much more work to be done to, well, from the U.S. perspective, I think that the U.S. should work on not trying to frame and pigeonhole the PLA in a certain way about de-escalation during conflict, that we need to understand Chinese perceptions of crisis management and why, for example, they wouldn't pick up the phone. We have to anticipate that. And on the other side, I think we need to work with the PLA on having some mechanism to work during times of disputes and crisis that is depoliticized. And I think, quite frankly, there's a lot of work to be done, but I guess maybe striking a positive tone, that from what I've seen, that not only do the channels exist, but they're used quite frequently. They're used during peacetime and they're used during crisis. And so not everything is the sky is falling when it comes to crisis communications. I think that there are links and they're used quite frequently, and they're used to de-escalate during certain crises.
Thanks for that, Lyle. And I like the fact that you make the point that these communication lines, the systems exist, the mechanisms exist, but it's just a matter of whether or not one side or the other wishes to employ them and deploy them at the same time and with the same things in mind when they do. So that's a lot of work to try to overcome just perceptually. Let me ask you, Rory, where do you see any possibilities of managing this strategic mistrust that we see deepening in the U.S. China relationship, maybe particularly on Taiwan or on other issues?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think I would say that it will be very difficult to manage strategic mistrust if we don't sustain some sort of official-to-official relationship. And although we do have a few channels in crisis communication, the overall network of diplomacy and diplomatic interactions between the U.S. and China has really dwindled since the end of the second Obama administration until now, when we had hundreds of dialogues going on, now to just a few, I think, channels, and most of those channels relegated to very issue-specific areas. So I really think the way forward is to get back to a process, a larger process of dialogue, negotiation, and diplomacy between the two sides that cuts across both huge bureaucracies and matches policy responsibility across very different issue areas between ministries and departments in the United States. I think that is a stabilizing guardrail in and of itself, that who meets and where and when and why creates some action forcing mechanisms, not only within each system to consolidate policy decisions and do internal bargaining, but also create some momentum toward actually working on areas where we do have common interests. Both sides have said that they want to, in their own way, cooperate where we can, compete where we must, or work on areas of mutual interest. But what has not happened is to translate those kind of big leadership level grand principles into a process that both sides are comfortable with. And for China particularly, the nature of the government, the nature of the party state is that there must be some sort of process endorsement from the top level for lower level bureaucrats to feel comfortable working on issue-specific areas with their American counterparts. So I think that, in the next summit between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, another recommendation that I would humbly offer is that they agree on some sort of process. They designate envoys. They designate people to be in charge of how the two governments communicate with each other, so that we can kind of move forward with some of the areas of mutual interest and try as best we can to wall those off from the areas where we know that there will be political turbulence. Thank you.
Thanks, Ro. That's a great set of recommendations. Last word to you, Evan. We're at a wrap up here. I'm quite sure in hearing all these recommendations, you've thought back on your own experience, and where you would have had these very conversations with leaders in the White House about how to structure these sorts of conversations with China. And I suspect some who are in those positions now are turning to you for advice as well. So I'd love to have your take. Is there anything, something like this can come out of the Biden-Xi summit or not?
So I think the warning lights in the U.S.-China relationship are flashing red. I think we should all be exceptionally concerned. And this is from a former Obama administration official. I think that competition in the relationship is expanding, intensifying, and diversifying. I think the communication channels in the relationship have atrophied. I think it's largely China's fault that they have atrophied. After the recent activities around Taiwan, it was China that unilaterally decided to suspend 5 dialogues and cancel 3 dialogues. The Chinese constantly talk about communication as a gift to the United States, right? The Chinese ambassador to the United States just a few days ago said, we will resume cooperation on fentanyl, illegal fentanyl coming into the United States if the United States gets back to a place where it does things that don't continue to offend us. So I think that's where we are in the relationship. It has a 1950s quality to it, in which there really aren't any guardrails. And I think, as much as we talk about guardrails, and I think this entire panel was extremely articulate, everybody knows what all the guardrails are. All the professionals know exactly what the list is. But the reality is the Chinese are just not interested in talking about the guardrails. They're not interested in implementing them. They believe that the guardrails are seatbelts for the U.S. to go faster. They believe that guardrails are unilateral concessions by China, right? They believe that guardrails just allow the United States to take even more provocative actions. There's lots of things that those of us in the room that have worked with the Chinese know, but if there's one truism, it's when the Chinese are prepared to negotiate, when they really want to negotiate, you know it. It's crystal clear. When they don't want to negotiate, there are a million different excuses. And that's a lot like these conversations about crisis management, crisis communications, etc. They're not really serious. And the reason they're not serious is because the Chinese have not yet internalized the notion of strategic restraint. A lesson, sadly, the United States and the Soviet Union only learned after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that actually some aspect of restraint is in our long-term strategic interest because it could lead to a crisis that ultimately spirals out of control. And of course, we're both, nuclear weapon states. So I think the Chinese, for whatever reason, maybe it's because of the leadership transition, maybe it's because there aren't new foreign policy advisors that are ready to take the tough arguments to Xi Jinping. Maybe it's because Xi Jinping isn't interested. I don't know. But what I do know is if the Chinese were interested in crisis communications and interested in having the kind of strategic discussions that Dr. Rudd and Dr. Kissinger talked about, we absolutely could have those conversations. Look, the Obama administration tried to have them. We had the strategic and economic dialogue. President Obama met with his Chinese counterpart more times in his entire 8 years than all of his 5 predecessors combined. We made a serious effort at strategic dialogue, but it didn't change any of the trajectory that we were on, largely because, I think, of strategic decisions that Xi Jinping was making about his intentions and his capabilities. So I think we just haven't gotten to the point yet where the Chinese are interested in talking about and serious about implementing crisis communications. And I fear it's going to take some kind of unfortunate crisis in the relationship. And, because we're in this structural situation of a more competitive relationship, we clearly have a spark with Taiwan. Once the election cycle kicks up in Taiwan, that will sort of add more fuel to that particular situation. Which could, certainly could result in a crisis. So I'm sorry to end on such a sobering note, Bates, but what it means is that there's a lot of space for research. We are in a transition period, so perhaps in the next, Central Committee, there will be a new set of leaders that might be create more open political space. I'm not predicting it. There's no evidence to that to date. But certainly there's a lot of work to do, and I look forward to working with you and Kevin and everyone here.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that, Evan. I think we've had a pretty sobering conversation here. Just to flag that, the next panel coming up right after us is going to be looking at areas of potential collaboration, but it's not sort of on the strategic guardrail level. It's more on where can we find common interests and push ahead, and maybe that's just where we're going to have to be for the foreseeable future in our relationship with China. So I'm looking forward to that conversation coming right up. Before we start with them, though, let's give a round of applause to this excellent panel. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you.
starting off with a little humor. 各位老朋友，各位新朋友，下午好。I've been living in Shanghai for most of the last 20 years and doing a lot of events there for Forbes, and that's usually how we start out. So hard to change. I'm Russell Flannery. I'm a senior editor at Forbes. Thanks to Kevin and the Asia Society for inviting us to join this afternoon's wonderful, insightful event. Thanks also to the guests that are here today from MSK and the Asia Society. Congratulations to Kevin and the Asia Society for starting an important new center, which sounds like it will do an excellent job of looking for new fusions between different parts of society, not just in academia, but I think has great potential to bring together people from different walks of life. Who am I? I got started as a young Asia hand at the University of Wisconsin-Madison when I was studying China's agricultural reforms in the 1980s. And since then went on to open up Forbes' first ever bureau in the mainland in 2003. Since then have been in charge of our billionaires research and our wealth research in China. And also through the middle of last year was the editor-in-chief of our Chinese language edition of Forbes. So that's a little bit about myself. It's kind of striking to hear the pessimism in the last panel, but be here now to talk about the better hopes of the relationship. In brief, we have 4 outstanding panelists. Kevin, of course, is back on stage. Kate Logan, also from the Asia Society Policy Institute, is the Associate Director of Climate. Dr. Vickers is the new CEO of Sloan Kettering, which has played a very important role for Forbes in China through our Chinese language edition at bridging the conversation about collaboration in the fight against cancer. And last but not least, we have my close collaborator in that effort, Dr. Bob Lee, who is the physician ambassador to China and the Asia Pacific at Sloan Kettering. Kevin, first off, such a dark previous panel. Where are the fertile soil? Where is the fertile soil for collaboration in this relationship at this point? Who is involved, would you say, in bringing it about, and how are they going to do that?
Well, thanks, Russell. And I'm not just a sunny optimist because I'm a sunny Australian, and we have lots of sun in Australia. But I also am a rationalist, and I actually see rational grounds for hope. And rational grounds for hope exist because these two countries, these two cultures, these two civilizations have things that they have in common. And we simply need to apply the continuing magnifying glass to what they have in common and the common interests they wish to pursue, and, unfashionable as it may sound, some of the common values that they share. So, and our job at the Asia Society is always, as I've said in earlier formats today, the sound of two hands clapping. We will always talk about the problems, always talk about the challenges, but our mission is always to bring focus to bear on the opportunities as well. That's why I'm so glad to be here with colleagues today, including, of course, Kate from the Centre, from the Asia Society Policy Institute, but also Dr. Bob Lee from MSK, and a particularly warm welcome to Dr. Vickers. Being the CEO of Memorial Sloan Kettering is a big deal, and we're so glad to have you here. with us this afternoon, and to take time from your valuable program to share with us reflections on how we can collaborate in global public health between the two countries, and in particular in cancer, a challenge for both societies, and how do we advance the development of cancer treatment drugs expeditiously and effectively to the benefit of millions of real, live and suffering human beings. So, what's my overall comment about collaboration and the space for it? When I wrote this little book of mine called The Avoidable War, it advances not exactly a piece of rocket science, but some basic common sense which says you can do three things with this crazy relationship between America and the People's Republic of China. You can, in the area where we have strategic red lines, further define and have agreement on, assuming what Eva Medeiros said before is possible, agreement from China and the United States on what those red lines would be and what the guardrails should be around them, so as to reduce the risk of them escalating into crisis, conflict and war by accident. And so that's Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea, certain scenarios of the Korean Peninsula, and of course cyber and space, each of which represent a cocktail of risks on a daily basis. Second, if you do that, then you can have what I describe as non-lethal strategic competition in the rest of the relationship. The rest of foreign policy, other elements of security policy, also the economic relationship, strategic competition in technology, and even an ideology. Xi Jinping's view for the world versus a liberal democratic view of the world. But then there's a third basket as well, which you can, with effective conceptual management of this relationship, bring forward, and that is still providing political and diplomatic capital in the relationship to encourage collaboration between China and the United States in areas of common strategic interest, by which I mean global public health, by which I mean global action on climate change, by which I mean continued global financial stability, because neither system has an interest in there being a global financial crisis Mark II or Mark III. And on top of that, a combined interest in global nuclear non-proliferation, because that's not in the interest of these two nuclear powers either. If Japan was to develop a nuclear weapon, if the Republic of Korea was to develop a nuclear weapon, if Iran was, and then the Gulf monarchies were to develop nuclear weapons in response, the proliferation impact around the planet would be monumentally problematic for these two major powers, China and the United States. So in summary, what I'm saying, Russell, is this. In a concept of managed strategic competition, if it can be advanced in practice, if it's of substantive interest to both Washington and Beijing as a mechanism for stabilizing the relationship, not normalizing it, just stabilizing it, then it can grow in these three different ways. A more stabilizing set of mutually agreed guardrails, a more stable and predictable set of non-lethal competition in other domains, but also the political space to do what all of our other panelists are here to talk about, which is good stuff which helps humanity. Back to you.
So then it would be a top-down thrust that would still be required.
It's top-down thrust in the sense of providing the space, but bottom-up in terms of providing the work. Like smart people like these oncologists or smart people like climate change policy specialists can actually do the real work on the ground. It's a question of providing the space.
Kate, you have a long career already in climate. To what extent can we say that China is already being transformed by some of its work to achieve carbon neutrality?
Well, thanks so much, Russell. And I think I have not necessarily had quite the long career that some others have had here, but really privileged to be a part of this panel and also just to speak to, not quite, speak to the importance of another issue that is really a defining crisis of our generation, especially my generation and those beyond me, which is climate change. I think I'm going to respond by making a few observations and certainly standing on the shoulders of many fantastic analysts in the field to try and summarize these in a way that makes sense. The first is that in September 2020 at the UN General Assembly, when President Xi Jinping stepped forth and made China's announcement that they would peak carbon emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. This was a top-down announcement that really enshrined climate policy as economic policy. Of course, that's with many different headwinds sort of impacting the way that it plays out in the short term, but at least in the long term, among the many different development pathways that China could choose, they have chosen one that will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. And that has since then trickled down into many different policies, most foremost due to this 1+N climate policy system, network of policies where there is one sort of macro level 1 policy and then all of these different sectoral and topical focused N policies, sort of tangential but related to the 14th five-year planning system and looking forward out to peaking emissions by 2030 and obviously achieving carbon neutrality by 2060, which are much longer term goals. That said, what is missing, and forgive me for using a term that many have been using in other areas earlier today, are key guardrails around when China will peak emissions and at what level. And that's critical because the science says that we have to peak emissions by 2025 if we are to maintain reasonable hope of keeping global temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement, the REACH goal, or even 2 degrees Celsius, which is sort of what the lesser REACH goal is. And obviously, Dr. Rudd, my boss, knows that well, having been deeply involved in that process. So this is where it leads me to discuss a bit about this interplay between economic versus climate policy and what that looks like in practice in the near term. So I think one of the things that I want to point out is that in the midst of economic headwinds right now, it's really important to note, and I think this is something that's missing in general from the international conversation, that China has actually decreased its emissions in the last year. So quarter on quarter, if you look at the second quarter this year, there's an 8% decline since the previous year. And if you map that out over a year, that's actually around a 3% decline. And emissions have been sort of stalled. And one of the things this leads us to sort of analyze in terms of what this means for what I just mentioned about when and at what level China will peak emissions is this pattern of boom and bust with economic stimulus and how that relates to China's emissions. So previously, you have this story of economic slowdowns often resulting in industry-heavy stimulus, this idea of 国进民退, where many state-owned enterprises, which are heavy industry, are sort of boosted by the government, money is poured into them, and then you have a sort of increase in emissions as a result of economic stimulus. So I was working and living in Beijing back in 2016, saw this directly in terms of the pressures. And there was a time where some analysts were wondering whether China's coal consumption had peaked. But after the stimulus happened, it was pretty clear that that was not the case. We're sitting in one of these moments where there is an opportunity to adopt a cleaner stimulus going forward, but the question is what will happen in terms of all these economic headwinds, zero COVID, conflation of factors. The good news is that China has the most massive renewable build out in the entire world, and they're investing incredibly in all these different technologies that we need to decarbonize. And it's not really an issue of money or technology. It really is an issue of motivation and where the policy plays out in practice. A lot of the issues that analysts are pointing to right now in some respects as potentially being negative headwinds for climate in terms of China increasing coal production on a massive scale, also continuing to build new coal-fired power plants are really crisis response measures. And if China sits down and implements some of the harder reforms, especially when emissions are sort of stalled in this period of economic downturn, especially grid reform. We saw this play out in terms of how this past summer, especially with the hottest heat wave on record in China, really having massive impacts leading to electricity shortages again. And essentially, there's one pathway where China can adopt power sector reform and really make the difficult policy and motivation decisions to have a cleaner response measure going forward. But then there's another pathway where you continue to have this sort of crisis response and investment in heavy industry for economic stimulus. And that's really the question going forward is what will that look like in the next couple of years in this decisive decade for climate action?
Yeah, I should point out that, let me summarize your career accomplishments, if I may. You did work with Ma Jun at the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, certainly one of China's most influential forces for environmental good, and started out your career in Beijing as a Princeton and Asia Fellow at the National Resource...
Just throwing it out there. Sometimes the NRDC and NDRC get mixed up, so just keeping it straight.
At the Natural Resource Defense Council. So just thinking about Ma Jun, could you name a few names? Who are the drivers, would you say, for domestic policy push that we want to keep an eye out on over the coming period? You just talked about some of the big picture conflicts, older state-owned enterprises that maybe haven't invested as much in state-of-the-art power and energy equipment. But if we're trying to think of people to keep an eye on, who would you suggest?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and sort of happy to speak a bit about how that experience shaped me. And I think I sort of, have really been impacted by my own experience working for a domestic Chinese NGO and also for an international NGO that had been working in China for a long time in terms of seeing the value of constructive exchange. And actually, when I first started working at the Natural Resources Defense Council Beijing, I got there just as China was revising its key environmental protection law for the first time since it had been adopted. So it was being revised for the first time in 25 years. And I saw NRDC bring in a couple experts from the U.S. to sort of advise on some of the key provisions of that law. And once it was passed, saw sort of a floodgate of new momentum open up because they established through that revision, key amendments for environmental public interest litigation. So courts became strengthened as a mechanism, and also for information disclosure and public participation in some of these areas. But taking the international experience and then adapting it to a way that really fit the Chinese governance model, and that was some of the work that I was doing at IPE, which you referenced, where Ma Jun, my former boss, who is a journalist turned environmentalist, really pioneered the use of information disclosure as a mechanism for improving China's environmental quality, and essentially established this database where he collected what was public information issued by the government, but was scattered across different sources and collated it into a unified database that could then be used on one hand to ensure that local governments would comply with all these different regulations on information disclosure and transparency. And then, once they complied, that increases the amount of available information, but also as a means for constructively engaging international actors, such as multinational companies sourcing from China, to use the database to identify which of their factories have environmental violations and work with them to disclose information about their cleanup efforts, and really saw that as a mechanism for constructive exchange. Mm-hmm. I think your question in particular is a bit more about right now, what are some of the positive areas that we're seeing domestically, if I got that right, or internationally, or a little bit of both. I'm happy to speak to either.
Yeah, I was thinking about Madrid in your past, and how in today's environment it's so difficult to get an accurate read on what's happening on the ground. I think especially if we're here in the U.S., there's a wider gap on the people-to-people exchanges and the information side, wider gap than there's been in decades. And I think that an important goal of the new policy center for here will be to bring in more Chinese language resources and help with the transparency. But my question was actually about who should we be following on WeChat? who do we really want to try to keep an eye on that's a catalyst for good and that's an influencer in the environmental debate in China?
Yeah, terrific question, and would welcome you to respond to this as well if you have ideas to add. I think, there's a number of think tanks that have been established domestically in China that have really had a massive influence in terms of shaping China's environment and climate policy, and a lot of big names, especially at Tsinghua University, Beida as well, and there's a terrific Green Belt and Road Focus Center at Fudan University, I think it moved to, that's been doing a lot of work to ensure that green components are incorporated into China's international investments. So certainly this network of policy think tanks, but I think at the same time, there's also a number of other more local and grassroots NGOs throughout China that also play a role in terms of monitoring the local situation. When I was at IPE, we worked with a network of, I think it was 56, 57 NGOs throughout China that really fed local reporting to us and helped sort of keep an eye on whether or not the enterprises in their own jurisdictions were complying with these environmental laws and regulations.
Yeah, that seems to me to be quite an interesting area. Forbes has been covering healthcare and promoting the advance of healthcare research for decades, and we do that through the dozens of foreign language editions that we have. I was lucky to get to know Dr. Li through our Forbes China Healthcare Summit in particular. And very grateful to Dr. Li for all of his support with that. Bob, let me just call you Bob if I may. U.S. China relations aren't great. Why is collaboration with China to fight cancer at this point a good idea?
Thank you, Russell. I'd also like to thank the Honorable Kevin Rudd, Dr. Rudd, for your innovative leadership, outside the box leadership at Asia Society, and forming a collaboration with Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, injecting and elevating cancer into the global agenda. So if we take geopolitics and foreign policy aside, if you just look at cancer, this is a common enemy of humanity that kills 10 million lives every year around the globe, with devastating effects on families and loved ones. So it's not a quick death, it's a really cruel enemy. And I've seen this enemy with my own eyes in autopsy of patients. There is nothing natural about it. The only word is evil. Out of that 10 million deaths, 3 million deaths occur in China alone. This is the #1 in cancer death toll in terms of all countries. The United States is a #2 in terms of cancer death toll with 600,000 lives every year. So just from pure looking at the facts, it just makes sense for the #1 and #2 victims of cancer to work together against this common enemy. Now, how do we cure cancer? Well, despite the technological innovation, rapid advances in scientific discovery, we still need to do clinical trials. This is the process, it's a scientific process, whether it's a new drug or a new device, a radiation technology or a prevention, a vaccine, you got to put it through a scientific process with phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials to prove that it's safe for patients and to prove that it works in fighting cancer. And that process, unfortunately, in today's in general sense, is 10 to 15 years long, and most drugs and most innovations actually fail that process. And we've only got, if you do that a few life cycles, that's anyone's career, anyone's lifetime. If we just stick to that status quo, we're never going to cure cancer. Our grandkids are going to be faced with the same problem, and their grandkids the same. And this is frustrating to our patients and the families who are suffering today. So, however, clinical trials have evolved over the last few decades, particularly in the last decade, where international clinical trials have become a real reality. And this is where China has actually really demonstrated its contribution. And we are seeing glimpses of that hope of getting to that promised land of a cure for cancer. For example, the story of the targeted therapy EGFR inhibitors for lung cancer. Lung cancer is the most deadly cancer of all. It takes 2 million lives every year and it's just bad. Now, however, the EGFR inhibitors have been developed over the last decade, and in a large sense with Chinese contribution, because it happens that these EGFR mutations that drive a large proportion of lung cancers actually occur more commonly in women, in never smokers, and in Asians. So just by the sheer scale of the Chinese population, their participation in international trials of EGFR inhibitors have really accelerated the pace of that development. It's led to US FDA approval of EGFR inhibitors, as well as a world record in approval of AstraZeneca's Tagrisso from first in human trial to US FDA approval in 2.5 years. So instead of 10 to 15 years. So that's an example of what the scale of contribution and also the diversity of biology. When you, traditionally international trials in the 90s and the early 2000s have been largely United States and Europe, largely in a white population. But with Asian participation, there's now a diversity of participants and more discovery, rapid discovery and acceleration to approval. So that is the sheer scale and the diversity really accelerate that pace from 10 to 15 years to just 2 to 3 years. And the vaccine story, of course, the cancer vaccine, the HPV vaccine for cervical cancer was approved in 9 days in China after a change of regulatory policy when China joined the International Council of Harmonization and for the first time recognizing foreign data in mainland China. And rather than doing the same trial 10 to 15 years again in China, they recognize the data, it's harmonized 9 days with just enormous impact in terms of the number of lives saved. So there's a lot of potential there for US and China to work together to fight this common enemy.
Yeah, larger trials lead to faster testing of new drugs and the discovery of treatments that can save lives. Dr. Vickers, this sounds good in theory, but how does it fit in with what the US is doing right now, particularly under the Biden Cancer Moonshot Initiative?
Thank you, Russell, for having me here, and Honorable Kevin Rudd for inviting me. It's an honor, even in my early days, to participate, and it's certainly evident it's a priority with key leaders at Memorial, Dr. Lee and Sir Murray Brennan, who are leading our effort. I think it fits in large part because of both the mission of MSK, but also in the bigger picture of the Biden Moonshot Initiative, the opportunities to move drugs and to move them in a rapidity that can affect lives will often occur in a more effective way, as Bob described. It's engaging in the process of not only the discovery of the new targeted therapies or immunotherapies, but to truly make them work, there must be that proof of safety. It must require, in order to really be effective, the broad diversity that represents the scope of cancer disease in the world. And then there obviously needs to be efficacy. And so I think for many of the things that have been put forward to take place, it'd be short-sighted not to understand that international engagement is going to be critical in order for us to accomplish the goals of curing cancer. That's certainly, I think, the fundamental part of the mission at MSK is to be able to lead the world in this space, and probably the most practical way to do it is through clinical trials. And that's the way that we actually prove what we've conceived both in a lab and in an animal model actually will have the impact we want to see in patients' lives.
Thank you. Bob, of course, you're working with Kevin now on the Cure for Cancer initiative. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so this is a human mission, and in the last Forbes China Healthcare Summit, which you had kindly hosted, Russell, we had Greg Simon, the inaugural director of the White House Cancer Moonshot, calling this a human moonshot. So it's not just an American moonshot, but the whole of humanity. And this is, and just hearing Dr. Vickers' vision for MSK to be that, playing that global leadership role, to be the center of the world is invigorating. And this is a movement that really everyone has a role to play, whether you're coming from academia or from industry or from media, from policy leaders, from governments. Everyone has a role to play. And we need to get the message out of what is a clinical trial. Even my patients are still having a hard time understanding on the first visit. We need to better inform, empower our patients and their families of clinical trials are recognized as the best treatment of all cancer care. If you sit a board exam, the A, B, C, D, E, the multiple choice exam, the clinical trial is always the right answer. And because that is the treatment that incorporates today's best care and then attempts to go above and beyond that. And that's what a trial is, highly regulated, highly transparent. But we need that message to get to the public. We need the media leaders to help us spread the word. We need patients to be empowered. We also need navigators to help patients get onto those trials. We need the government policies to be laid out that is so patient-centric rather than get stuck with the bureaucracy or with geopolitics. So the movement is now, we call it a movement because we're really getting leaders from Forbes media, also from Bloomberg New Economy. We had, thanks to Kevin's leadership, we formed a international cancer coalition at the New Economy Forum, and where we gathered the U.S. FDA, with top regulators around the world, along with industry leaders in biopharmaceutical companies and technology companies, as well as leading academic centers and the National Cancer Institute. So this is, we have to do this together outside of our the silos of our own profession, but reach out because it's a human moonshot, getting it together, and we may be able to accelerate that pace of cure and see it, realistically see it in this lifetime. My patients want it in their lifetime, so even faster.
Dr. Vickers, would you like to suggest an agenda for wider collaboration at the global level, at the domestic level, in the fight against cancer?
No, I think Mr. Rudd highlighted in the book, The Avoidable War, around the areas where we may actually have some focus. And I think Bob mentioned it as well. There can be a common enemy. There can be a common enemy that is actually by all means evil, and that's cancer. And I think we can establish an opportunity of mutual good and benefit across the entire globe, with there being really credible interest not only in the United States, but in China, in Africa, and in Europe, around this enemy that kills nearly 10 million people a year. And I think that's a safe space where there is not one taking advantage or of another, but actual mutual gain from advancing it. And I think, as Bob highlighted, a part of the standard care of delivery and the complex nature of treating cancer is having clinical trials available. We cure just over, maybe under or over 50%, so there's half the people with cancer are going to recur and going to need something beyond what we call standard of care right now. And for that to have an effect, clinical trials clearly need to be on the agenda for the world, not only just cancer centers like MSK. And absolutely, the goal and the ability to have people to understand that trials are valuable is really paramount. In many areas, it's less than 5% of the people who get cancer care get on trials. And it's largely because, as Bob said, they don't understand the best care occurs on trials because you get the greatest attention. You get CAT scans on time. You get your medications on time. All those are driven because the attention is focused on that patient. So empowering individuals across the world to do it, broadening diversity, which means it pushes us to expand outside of our culture. One of the great benefits is that this becomes a broader culture than just Western or Eastern. It actually becomes a world culture. That enhances how medicine becomes effective and accessible to the world. So there is great mutual benefit to have a common focus on an enemy like cancer that would affect in a positive way for both China and America.
Yeah, I think that this is quite an important point for everybody sitting here who's a bridge between the U.S. and China, as we all are, where we're talking about space on the China side for collaboration and healthcare. which we see in our Forbes events that are supported by representatives of the Chinese government, and space for collaboration for smart, world-leading institution here in New York, like MSK, which is able to marshal global resources to achieve common good. So it's wonderful to hear Dr. Vickers talking about impactful, meaningful goal. But doing it's something more akin to a microeconomic level effort to solve a macroeconomic level problem. Kevin, would you like to make some final comments, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. I'm always inspired when I deal with oncologists. I mean, and it's really smart folks at MSK. I mean, I'm just a political scientist. You actually do real science, okay? And real science produces real results in the real world. Often political scientists just create problems for the real world. But you solve real problems in the real world. That's the first principle. Occasionally, political scientists can be helpful, but rarely. Number two, the fact that MSK, which is a global brand and a global institution of global standing, is now taking the lead in driving global collaboration in this area, Dr. Vickers, is something which we'd like to thank you for. It's really important globally. And you're not just dealing with the good old US of A, important though that is. It's the country we are resident in, but for the world at large. And number three, the fact that you've got Dr. Bob here as your leading emissary is really helpful. Not only is he a great oncologist, not only is he from a great hospital, MSK, he's also Australian. And so he wins the trifecta. And so with MSK, Dr. Bob, and Australia behind you, you can only succeed. So, and I think what I'd say in conclusion is, when it comes down to the actual mechanics of regulatory impediments between China and the US on advancing trials of appropriate treatments, then we're there to help as the Asia Society, because we're in the bridge building business. A lot of people blow up bridges, we try to build bridges. So when you reach those points in your trial work with the US, Chinese, or other regulators around the world, there's a problem. Please get onto us, because that's our job, to try and blast open the way through. So put your hands together for MSK. I think they're great.
Thank you, Kevin. So I wanted to add that Asia Society is really a think, do tank. So under Dr. Rudd's leadership, you've actually played an important role in the fight against cancer. The US FDA had worked with us on the Project Orbis, which is a initiative, government agency initiative, getting agencies from around the world to simultaneously have a mechanism to simultaneously review innovative products and new discoveries, and to potentially simultaneously approve it and to get mass access to patients in their own countries. Many countries like Australia has joined, Canada, Brazil, Singapore, Switzerland, UK, but China has not. And through Dr. Rudd and his team at Asia Society, we've been able to formulate dialogue with the China side, with the National Medical Products Administration, a very highly influential minister, Minister B from China, who actually was instrumental in getting China to join the International Council of Harmonization. This was the story behind 9 days for Gardasil 9, just a sea change, and created the whole biotechnology industry in China subsequent to that regulatory change. So Dr. Rudd has actually created really that space, and China has not yet signed an agreement to collaborate on Project Orbis. There's a lot of goodwill between the regulators. Actually, both sides want to do it. It's just not the right political time, and nobody wants to stick their neck out at the moment. but Dr. Rudd is keeping the finger on the pulse, and there may be an opening at some point where both countries, instead of, yes, you've got to compete, but instead of fighting all the time, maybe do something productive. Help us cure cancer, get us to that promised land, and with your visionary leadership at Asia Society and also the global vision of Dr. Vickers, I can see, and us working all together, that'll take us really to the promised land. I want to see it in my lifetime. My patients want it in theirs. Thanks.
Okay, I think unfortunately the topic is great, and we're just scratching the surface of it. But we'll have to conclude for now. Thank you very much, Kevin, for having us. It's a pleasure to have a chance to meet so many folks interested in U.S. China relations. Hope to keep in touch in the future. Thank you again.